Between the world of the living and the world of the dead, there exists a veil, thin as mist, pale as moonlight on still water. Some souls wander there, not quite arrived, not quite gone. One figure tends to that in-between place, a goddess born of the underworld itself, whose name was spoken only in whispers. She is Melinoe, and tonight she walks the boundary so you do not have to. Take a moment to subscribe, but only if these stories genuinely bring you peace. Now find your quiet. The mist is already drifting. Here, in the deep quiet of Olympus dreams, the story begins not with a birth or a proclamation, but with a sound, a low, continuous sound moving beneath everything else. The sound of lamentation carried on slow water. The river Kokytos does not rush. It does not tumble over stones or sing against its banks. It moves with the heaviness of grief itself, carrying on its current every sorrow that has ever been wept into it. In the underworld, where light does not reach from above, the river finds its own dim luminescence, a pale grey gleam rising from the water's surface like the memory of fog. Persephone stood near its banks. She had walked this path many times. She knew the sound of the Kokytos, the way one knows a familiar piece of music heard so often it becomes part of breathing. The river's voice was woven into her daily life below the earth, part of the permanent backdrop of her existence as queen of this deep realm. But on this evening, something had changed. She could not name it immediately. She stood very still, listening, the hem of her dark robe barely stirring against the pale stone of the river bank. The Kokytos moved past her in its usual unhurried procession. The shades of the dead drifted somewhere behind her, going about their quiet business. The air, always cool here, pressed gently against her face. And yet there was something else beneath the river's voice. Not a sound exactly, more like a pressure. The way the air changes before a storm arrives, carrying the memory of thunder before any thunder has been heard. Persephone tilted her head. She was not given to imagining things. She was a queen, practical and perceptive, accustomed to the strange and solemn workings of the realm her husband governed. She did not startle easily, but this feeling along the river bank was not one she recognized. The Kokytos moved. Its grey water caught whatever dim light existed in this underworld afternoon and threw it back, distorted, rippling, changed. She watched the surface of the river. The water did not speak. It never did, not in words, but it carried things, ancient things, impressions left by the sorrows that had fed it over countless ages. She had learned to read the river's mood the way one reads the expression of a face, not in language but in feeling. And the feeling tonight was different. The water seemed to lean toward her somehow, to press its current in her direction with something that resembled intention, as though the river itself was attempting to draw her attention to what it carried, as though some quality of the future had already reached the Kokytos, deposited there ahead of its own arrival, waiting to be felt by whoever stood close enough. Persephone did not move away. She stayed where she was, watching the grey surface, feeling that indescribable pressure settle around her like a second cloak. Far off, barely audible, something wailed. One of the shades, perhaps, or the river bending around a deep curve somewhere upstream. The sound carried no specific meaning. It was simply the voice of lamentation, doing what lamentation does, rising and falling and returning. She thought of her mother. She often thought of Demeter when she stood near the water. Demeter, who lived above in the world of seasons, who tended the growing things, who presided over warmth and ripening, and the sweet generosity of the harvest. Her mother's world was filled with gold. The gold of grain, of late afternoon sunlight, of fresh honey dripping from the comb. And here was Persephone, standing on a grey shore beside a river of grief, feeling something press against her from a future she could not yet see. She had made peace with this duality long ago. Her life ran in two directions at once, always, above and below, green and grey, living and dead. She had ceased to struggle against it, the way a young woman ceases to struggle against the nature of her own face. This was what she was. This was the shape of her. But the feeling at the river's edge was not about her old, familiar duality. It was about something new. The Kokytos moved. Its surface caught a slight disturbance, a ripple spreading outward from no visible source, passing through the pale grey gleam of the water and dissolving at the far bank. Something had been disturbed upstream. Something, or the anticipation of something, had touched the river. Persephone felt it travel through the soles of her feet. She had no name for it yet. She had no image to attach to the feeling. But it settled into her like a stone settling into deep water, slowly, with a completeness that could not be taken back. She felt it land somewhere central in her, somewhere beneath thought and decision, in the wordless interior where the truest knowing lies. She would remember this moment later. She would stand in an entirely different quality of grief and wonder, and she would trace it back to this evening on the riverbank, to the pale disturbance on the Kokytos, to the sound of lamentation moving past her in the dark, for now she simply stood. The river carried its grey water onward. The shades moved behind her. The air pressed cool and quiet against her face. A gift, one sometimes felt, wore the face of an ordinary evening before it revealed what it truly was. Grace could be dangerous in that way. It arrived wearing neutral clothing. It gave no warning. The Kokytos did not warn her. It only moved and wailed, and carried the future downstream ahead of its own arrival, the way grief always knows something before grief is ready to speak it clearly. Persephone stood at the bank a long while. Then she turned slowly and walked back into the dim heart of the underworld. Behind her the river continued its quiet procession, grey and luminous and full of what it knew. The underworld was not one place. This was the thing that mortals rarely understood when they imagined it at all. They pictured darkness, a single vast cavern perhaps, or an endless flat plain of shadow. They imagined something simple, something that could be held in a single thought. But the underworld was a country, a vast internally complex country with its own geography, its own weather, its own regions that differed from one another the way highland differs from coast. Persephone knew this better than anyone. She had walked its distances, she had learned its moods. As she moved away from the Kokytos that dim afternoon, her footsteps soft against the pale stone, she passed through the layers of the realm the way one moves through the rooms of a very old house. Each space with its own quality of air, each space with its own particular silence. The underworld of the Orphic tradition was not a single kingdom but a layered cosmos. It held within it all the gradations of existence that lay beyond life's edge. The newly dead arriving confused at the riverbank, the ancient shades who had grown accustomed to the grey and moved through it with something like ease. The blessed in their fields and the condemned in their deep place, and between those extremes a vast middle country where most souls simply continued, quieter than life, less urgent, moving through their days the way water moves through stone. The rivers defined it. Any understanding of the underworld began with the rivers. There was the Styx first, the oldest, the most sovereign. Its waters ran black and cold and carried in them a weight that no living thing could easily survive. The gods themselves swore by the Styx. When a divine oath was spoken over its water, something fundamental was invoked, something older than any single god. The Styx was not Hades' river, not in the way the others were. It was older than Hades. It flowed through the underworld's deepest channel, and it did not belong to anyone, and that was precisely what made it sacred. Then there was the Lethe, the river of forgetting. Its waters ran pale, pale and still and faintly luminous in a way that was almost beautiful if you did not know what you were looking at. The shades who drank from the Lethe released everything, their names, their histories, the texture of their hands and the sound of the voices they had loved. They drank and they became simplified. ready to be returned to the cycle of existence, unburdened by the weight of what they had already been. Persephone had always regarded the Lethe with a complex feeling. She understood its mercy. She also understood what it asked. And there was the Kokytos, the river she had just left. The Kokytos was not a river of mercy or a river of power. It was a river of grief, simply, plainly, completely. It gathered the lamentation of the dead, the tears they wept for what they had lost, the sorrow of separation from the sunlit world. All of it flowed into the Kokytos, and the Kokytos carried it. And the river grew heavier with every age that passed, fed continuously by all the grief that the underworld produced. It was the least glamorous of the rivers. It had no great power over oaths. It did not erase or transform. It only received. It only held. Persephone understood why she was drawn to it. She walked further from the bank into the wider expanse of the realm. Here the terrain opened. Low slopes of dark stone rose on either side, and between them ran a plain that stretched further than the eye could follow with any precision. The air was cool and still. It always was. There was no wind in the underworld, nothing that moved the air the way wind moved it above. Instead, the atmosphere simply rested against things, against stone and pale earth, and the drifting forms of the shades. The shades themselves populated the plain in their slow numbers. They moved without urgency, without destination, most of them. They had nowhere in particular to arrive. They had already arrived in the most complete sense of the word. This was their place now, and they inhabited it the way old inhabitants inhabit old places, familiarly, without much looking around. Some were gathered near the plain's far edge, where a stand of pale trees grew, asphodel, grey-leafed and silent. The flowers were small and colourless. They offered no perfume, but they grew, and their growing was something. A small persistence of organic life in the land of the dead. Hades watched over all of it. This was not metaphorical. Hades was present in his realm the way a great stone is present in a landscape. Fundamentally, definitively. He was not always visible. He did not walk the plain or station himself at the river banks. He was in his hall most often, attending to the business of governance that a realm this vast continuously produced. Souls needed judgment. Disputes required resolution. The structures of the afterlife, which were intricate and ancient, needed constant tending. He was not a cold god. That was the other thing mortals got wrong. Persephone had learned this in the long years since her arrival. He was contained. He was grave. He held things tightly, in the way that someone who presides over infinite grief must hold themselves tightly or be overwhelmed by it. But beneath the containment there was something genuine, something that valued order, because order, in this kingdom, was the only form of kindness available. The dead deserved to be organized. They deserved to move through their eternity with some structure to support them. He had built that structure. He maintained it without ceasing. She respected him for it, in the deep practical way that one respects a fellow worker who does their work well. His hall stood at the underworld's interior, not its geographic centre exactly. The underworld had no clean centre in the way a circle has a centre, but the hall felt central. It pulled the realm around it, the way a heavy object pulls everything in its vicinity toward it without moving itself. The hall was built of dark stone. Its proportions were enormous, not ostentatiously so, simply in keeping with the scale of what it administered. Inside, the throne was black, not decorated, not gilded. Simply the darkest stone the underworld offered, carved into a form that communicated authority without requiring any additional ornament. Hades sat upon it with a stillness that Persephone had sometimes thought was less like a posture and more like a quality of his nature. He did not fidget. He did not lean. He held his position the way the realm itself held its position, without apparent effort, without apparent strain. Her own throne stood beside his. White stone, in the tradition of her connection to the world above, white and dark side by side. The hall's light, such as it was, caught both and threw neither back in the way sunlight would have. The illumination down here came from sources that did not blaze. Torches that burned steadily and without warmth, a faint phosphorescence in certain stones. And the rivers, distantly, giving off their cold grey gleam. This was the world that would hold the child whose presence she had felt at the riverbank. She did not know that yet, standing in the hall's long threshold and looking in at the quiet interior. She did not know how completely the child would belong to this place, or how completely the child would also belong elsewhere. The underworld spread around her in all its grey and solemn architecture, its rivers, its plains, its shades drifting through their eternity of dim continuance. Its king, still and sovereign on his black throne, all of it waiting, though it did not know it was waiting, for something that would arrive carrying both its darkness and something else entirely. The distant plain of asphodel caught a faint stir, not wind, simply the movement of many shades adjusting their slow processional. A small sound carried across the still air, neither speech nor lamentation, only presence. Persephone rested her hand briefly against the cool stone of the threshold. Then she moved inside, into the hall's quiet interior, leaving the grey expanse of her kingdom spread out behind her, patient and immense and absolutely unchanged. Hades was already aware of her when she crossed the threshold. He did not look up immediately. This was not dismissal. It was simply his way. He completed the matter before him first, a thin tablet of pale stone upon which the records of recent arrivals were marked. He set it aside with care. Then he raised his eyes. Persephone had come to know that look, steady, entirely present. When Hades looked at something, he looked at all of it. There was no portion of his attention held elsewhere. This was, she had concluded, both a gift and a weight. To be seen that completely, all at once, required some adjustment. She crossed the hall's floor. Her steps carried in the quiet, not loudly, but the hall did not absorb sound the way the plain outside did. It held it briefly, then released it. She took her seat, white stone cool beneath her. The torches along the walls burned their steady, heatless light. The hall rested around them both, large and composed. Hades spoke first, not of anything urgent. He asked whether the Kokytos ran as it had, whether she had noticed any change at its near bank. She considered the question. She told him it ran as it always did. Heavy, without variation. He nodded once, returned his attention briefly to a second tablet, then set that one aside as well. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It had not been uncomfortable for a long time. It was a silence that had been worn smooth by repetition, by years of this same hall, these same thrones, this same steady torchlight between them. Some silences are empty. This one had texture to it. She did not tell him what she had felt at the riverbank. Not yet. She was not sure what there was to tell. A disturbance in the current, a sense of something gathering or already gathered that she could not name. It had not felt like threat. It had felt like imminence. Imminence was harder to explain. She watched him instead. The way he held the tablet, the slight movement of his hand against the stone's edge, not restless, only present. She had learned more about Hades through these small observations than through anything spoken directly. He communicated through the way he occupied space, quietly, thoroughly, without excess. The hall held its proportions around them. Enormous, but not oppressive. Built to contain the governance of the dead, which was a business that required room to breathe. even if nothing here breathed in quite the mortal way. Then the change came. Persephone felt it before she understood it, a shift in the quality of the hall's still air. Something almost like warmth, though not warmth exactly, a pressure. A brightness contained within itself, not blazing outward, but present in the way a coal is present beneath ash, something alive in a manner distinct from the underworld's life. She turned. He stood at the far end of the hall near the great entrance. He wore darkness well. She would grant him that. The disguise was considered. The form he had taken was close enough to Hades that a less observant witness might have been deceived. The height was right, the composure was approximated. Even the stillness had been imitated, though it was imitation, and she felt the difference immediately. It was a stillness performed rather than inhabited. Zeus, she knew him. Not through his face, through the particular quality of his presence, which was different from Hades' presence, the way lightning is different from stone. Both substantial, both powerful. But one moved, one arrived. One carried with it the possibility of sudden alteration. She did not speak immediately. He came forward. His footsteps, unlike hers, were absorbed by the hall's floor rather than carried. He had learned that much at least. He moved as the dead moved here, without audible weight, but not without weight. What he said she would not hold in her memory with perfect clarity afterward, not because she forgot, but because the words themselves were secondary to what they contained. He had come with intention. He wore his brother's face as borrowed cloth. He spoke in tones calibrated to the underground, lower than his usual register. Stripped of the authority he normally carried openly, she looked at him. He was Zeus in the depths, and the depths did not suit him. He was made for height, for atmosphere and sky and the open distances of the upper world. Down here he was a torch flame in a space built for phosphorescence. Present, visible, but misaligned with his surroundings. She did not send him away. This too was a choice. It settled in the back of her understanding as such, even then. A choice made not from powerlessness, but from something more complex than simple consent. He was her father's brother. He was the sovereign of the upper world. He was the god she had been before this place became her place. A thread of her former life come down to where she now lived. There was a tenderness in that. Wound in it as well. Both things were true simultaneously. The Kokytos, far behind her across the plain, moved in its heavy way. She could not hear it from here. But she felt its direction, the river of grief running through the lowest channels of the earth. She had stood at its bank that very day. She had felt something in its current that she could not name. Now she thought she understood what she had felt, not threat, not promise, the first breath of something that had not yet arrived. Whatever passed between her and Zeus in the hall's interior, it was not simple. Nothing in the underworld was simple. The place was too old for simplicity. It had been receiving complexity since before the first mortal walked the upper world. Every shade who arrived here brought their entire complicated life with them. The realm had been built, gradually, to hold all of that, to organize it, to give it somewhere to rest. What happened in the hall that day would rest here too, in the cold and steady architecture, in the torchlight that cast no warmth, in the stones that held their own faint phosphorescence. When Zeus departed, the hall returned to its previous quality of air, still and cool and composed. Persephone sat for a long time after. Hades did not return until the torches had cycled through their slow burning. When he came back in from the passages that led deeper into the realm's administrative corridors, he carried the usual weight of governance, tablets, the particular containment of a god who has just resolved something difficult. He took his throne. He did not ask where she had been or what had occurred. He would not have known to ask. The hall gave nothing away. It kept all its histories in its stones, as it always had, and offered none of them back. She looked at the black throne beside her white one, at the two colours sitting together in the torchlight without competition, each occupying its own portion of the space. She thought of the Kokytos. She thought of immanence, somewhere deep beneath even the hall's stone foundations. The river of grief continued its heavy movement, carrying what it had always carried. Carrying now, perhaps, something more, something that had begun its gathering near the river's mouth. A presence that would take months to become a form that would, when it arrived, carry both the darkness of this place and the brightness that had briefly walked through it in disguise. She pressed her fingers against the arm of her white throne. The stone was very cool, very certain, very much itself, and she was very quiet beside it, watching the torches burn their steady, warmthless light, while the hall around her held its ancient composure, and the realm spread outward in every direction, patient and immense, and entirely unchanged on its surface, though something beneath had already shifted. The days that followed moved the way all days moved in the underworld, without distinguishable light, without the shift of temperature that marks morning from evening in the world above. The torches in the hall cycled through their burning. The shades arrived at their appointed intervals, processed through the realm's ancient accounting, and dispersed to their various portions of the dark. Persephone moved through it all. She had always moved through it. This was not new, but now her movement had a different quality to it. A slight inward attention, a listening that was not directed at any sound the realm was producing, but at something forming in a quieter register than sound. The shades noticed. They always did, in their oblique way. The dead did not look directly at her, as a rule. They were occupied with the business of being dead, which was its own absorbing work. But when she passed through the asphodel meadows that stretched behind the great hall, the shades paused in their grey wandering. They turned slightly. Not toward her, more like plants turning toward a warmth they could not fully perceive. She did not acknowledge this. She walked among them with her usual steadiness. Her white robe moved through the grey figures of the departed, and the hall's light, such as it was, caught the edges of that white cloth and held it. The meadows were never fully silent. The shades produced a low, continuous murmur, not speech exactly, more like the memory of speech, stripped of content, retaining only cadence. Persephone had learned, over her years in this place, to find it peaceful rather than sorrowful. The sound of all human utterance reduced to its most basic form, presence without meaning, continuation without narrative. She walked to the far end of the meadows, where the asphodel grew densest, and stood there for a time. The river Styx was distant from this position. She could not see it, but she knew its direction, the way she knew the direction of all the realm's water. The rivers were its ordering principle. They gave the flat, dark geography its structure. Without them, the underworld would simply be a space. The rivers made it a place. She had been thinking more about water since Zeus's visit. Not about Zeus himself precisely. That thought she kept at a certain distance. Not from unwillingness, but from the recognition that it was too large to think about directly. It required the same approach as a bright object seen in the lower world's permanent dimness. You perceived it better at an angle. You learned its shape by the space around it rather than by staring at its centre. What she returned to again and again was the Kokytos. She had stood at its bank on the day of the visit. She had felt something in its current, indistinct and preliminary. In the days following she found herself drawn back toward the river at intervals. Not with urgency, more as one returns to a half-completed thought, patiently, without forcing resolution. The Kokytos ran through the lowest channels of the realm. To reach it from the meadows required passing through the quieter corridors, the passages where the ceiling dropped and the phosphorescence of the stone gave the only light. Persephone walked these corridors with the ease of long familiarity, She knew where the ceiling lowered. She knew where the floor was uneven. She knew which passages opened onto broad spaces and which simply continued, turning gently deeper. The river's sound reached her before she arrived. That low, inconsolable movement. Water that carried grief not as metaphor but as substance. The ancient poets had understood this, had named it for what it was. The Kokytos did not merely represent lamentation. It was lamentation, distilled, given specific weight and direction, set moving through the permanent dark. She came to its bank. The water moved in its familiar way. Heavy, unvaried. The surface showed no reflection here, because there was no light to reflect. The river was perceived primarily through sound and through a certain coolness in the air above it. A coolness different from the hall's settled cold, more alive than that. More current. Persephone stood at the bank for a long time. Hades found her there. He came along the far corridor, his movement absorbing itself into the passage as it always did. Quiet, heavy, purposeful but unhurried. When he saw her at the bank, he did not change his pace. He simply came to stand beside her, at the comfortable distance that had developed between them over the years, not close enough to impose, not far enough to indicate separation. He looked at the river. She looked at the river. After some time, he set down the tablet he was carrying against the corridor wall. A small gesture, an indication that he had no immediate intention of returning to administrative work. She noticed it without commenting. The Kokytos moved between them and the opposite bank, unhurried, carrying its indefinite weight. Hades did not ask what she was thinking. He rarely asked. He had learned, over their long years together in this place, that questions of that kind often interrupted rather than invited. She had come to value this particular quality of his attention. He made space. He did not fill it. She said, at last, that something was changing. He received this without reaction, in the way he received most information. Processing it inwardly, at whatever depth he processed things, she said she could feel it near the river. Something gathering, taking on weight. Not yet form. He was quiet for a while after that. The Kokytos moved. A shade drifted somewhere in the far passages, its grey presence barely registering at this distance. Then Hades said something low and considered, something about the river knowing things before the realm's other structures did. About the water being older than the architecture, older perhaps than any order that had been imposed upon this place. She had not thought of it in those terms before. She considered it now. The Kokytos predated the thrones. It predated the meadows and the careful routing of the dead through their various destinations. The water had been moving here before the underworld had been organized into its current form, before the living had given it names and assigned it functions. It carried its own knowledge, independent of all that came after. She pressed her fingers to her own wrist, feeling her pulse there. The living pulse that set her apart from every shade that moved through this realm. That pulse had been the first thing she had noticed about herself after the descent, years ago. The fact of it, the insistent, quiet proof. Now she thought about what else might pulse, what else might carry, in its moving, a rhythm that predated naming. Hades retrieved his tablet eventually, not abruptly, with the easy pragmatism of a god who had learned to hold the large and the practical simultaneously. He would carry the thought of the river forward. He would also carry the accounting of the recent dead, both things. Without contradiction, she watched him move back along the corridor. Then she turned again to the Kokytos. The water moved in the dark, making its low sound. Nothing visible had changed at its surface, but somewhere beneath it, or somewhere in the air above it, or in some register that had no spatial address at all, the gathering continued. Patient, not yet visible, not yet named. A new weight in an ancient current. The river received it, as it received everything, without alteration of its surface, and without interruption of its flow. The gathering did not resolve itself all at once. Persephone had expected something more decisive. Some clear signal, some moment of arrival that would announce itself and make understanding possible. Instead, the thing near the river continued as it had been, a presence without edges. A weight that shifted when she moved toward it and settled back when she turned away. She returned to the bank the next day, and the day after that. There was no measuring of days here, not in the way the upper world measured them, but she had developed her own quiet accounting. She knew how long Hades was occupied with the judicial work of the realm. She knew when the shades moved in their slow patterns through the meadows and when they stilled. These intervals served as a kind of time for her, rough and consistent. At the river she waited. The Kokytos gave her nothing direct. It moved as it always moved, with that heavy, unhurried weight. The coolness above its surface stayed the same. The sound stayed the same, and yet the accumulation of her visits had changed something. Not in the river, in her. She was learning to hold what could not yet be understood, to stand beside it without demanding clarification. Her white robe pooled at her feet. The phosphorescent stone of the passage walls gave off its faint grey light behind her. Before her, only the dark above the river's surface, only the sound. She became aware of the difference in her own body gradually. A fullness in her chest that was not grief, not quite. A heaviness behind her sternum that had no immediate cause. She knew the textures of grief as well as any being who had spent long years in this place. This was adjacent to that, close to it. But not the same. Something was growing. The understanding came without drama, no revelation, no sudden clarity, simply the recognition of what had been present for some time before she had words for it. She placed both hands flat against her abdomen and stood very still. The Kokytos moved. She did not move. After some time, she sat down on the stone shelf that ran along the bank. It was cold under her, that settled cold of the passages. She stayed there with her hands where they were, feeling for something she could not quite locate, a pulse other than her own. A rhythm just beginning to separate itself from the surrounding silence. The shades in the far passages made their wordless sound. That cadence without content, the memory of speech passing back and forth among them like something they could not release. She had grown so accustomed to that sound that she rarely heard it any more. Now it reached her, moved through her, found something to resonate against in the new heaviness she was carrying. She understood then what the river had known before her, what it had been receiving for some time at its banks. Not a message from outside herself, something already inside her, already becoming. The grief of the Kokytos, the particular substance of it. Whatever was growing in her had been knit together in this place, near this water. Had drawn from the very air of lamentation some fundamental quality it would carry forward. She did not know what to do with this knowledge. She held it as she held most large things here, steadily, without moving away from it. When Hades came along the far passage later, she was still sitting on the stone shelf. He saw her differently positioned than usual and paused. He did not ask. She knew he was waiting, in the way he waited, with the door left open. She said it simply, that she was carrying a child. He stood in the passage entrance for a long moment. The tablet he was carrying stayed in his hand. He did not set it down this time. She noticed that, the small difference from his usual gesture. He was holding both things more tightly now. His face, in the dim light, told her very little. It rarely did. Hades had learned, over long centuries of governance, to receive information before responding to it, to let it reach him fully before allowing it to alter his expression. She knew this about him, and usually found it a reasonable quality. Now she found it very difficult. She waited. He came forward along the bank and sat beside her on the stone shelf, at the comfortable distance, present, The Kokytos moved between them and the far bank. What passed between them in the silence that followed was not simple. She could feel his thoughts moving, though she had no direct access to them. Could feel the weight of what he was working through. There was something in his posture that was not quite still. A tension held very carefully at the surface of his stillness. She knew what he was not saying. She knew it because she had not said it either. Zeus had been here. Some weeks ago, by her accounting, he had walked the passages with his terrible brightness dimmed to something manageable. He had stood beside her at this same bank, and afterward she had not been able to think about it directly. Had held it at the same oblique angle she held all things too large to examine. She could not examine it now. What she knew was this: something was growing. It had begun here, near this water, in this air made of lamentation. Whatever child came from such a beginning would carry this place in its very constitution. Would be made, in some essential part, of what the Kokytos held. Hades did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was level, low. He said only that the realm would receive what came, that it always had. She nodded. The stone shelf was cold beneath her. The river moved in its slow, unvaried way. Somewhere in the far passages a shade drifted past a torch bracket, and the light shifted briefly before returning to its settled position. She pressed her fingers again to her wrist. Her pulse was there. Strong, distinct. The living thing she carried inside this place of the permanent dead. Now, under her other hand, she thought she could feel it. Or almost feel it. A beginning of something. A rhythm that was not hers, faint. Not yet insistent, but present, the way the gathering at the river had been present before she understood it. There, unmistakably there. The Kokytos received this too, as it received everything. The sound of it did not change. The surface did not alter, but some register that had no spatial address took note. An ancient water, carrying its ancient grief, flowing now around the beginning of a new weight, a child of this place. A child of its lamentation, a child of the dark, and whatever brightness had passed through it. Not yet born, not yet any particular thing, but already drawing, from the currents around it, what it would be. The months that followed moved in the particular way that underworld time moved, not slowly exactly, not quickly, in a manner that had no name in the upper world's vocabulary. Persephone measured it by what changed in her body, and by what changed in Hades. He began setting the tablet down again. She noticed this after several of his visits. He would come along the far passage, cross to where she sat, and before he settled beside her, he would lower the tablet to the stone shelf and lay it flat. The old gesture returned, deliberate, as if he had decided something and enacted the decision quietly, without announcement. She did not remark on it. Some things between them did not require words. Her body was changing in ways that surprised her. She had not known what to expect of a pregnancy in this place. No warmth of seasons to mark stages. No Demeter nearby to tell her what was ordinary and what was not. She found herself relying on what she could observe directly. The new heaviness. The way certain smells from the river reached her differently. A faint pulling sensation, low and persistent, that she had come to think of as the child locating itself more firmly in the world it was forming from the Kokytos, from the cool passage air, from her. One evening, by her reckoning, Hades arrived and did not sit immediately. He stood at the bank and looked at the water for a moment before turning toward her. His expression was not quite his governance expression, the one he wore in the judgment halls. This was something with more unguarded texture to it. He asked how she was sleeping. It was an ordinary question. A careful one. She understood that he was using it to approach something larger without naming that larger thing directly. This was how Hades moved through emotional territory, from the edges inward. Patiently, She told him she was sleeping adequately, that the child moved sometimes in what she thought were the quiet hours, though without light and dark to anchor the word night, she used quiet hours as a rough equivalent. He nodded. He sat beside her and placed the tablet face down on the stone. She watched him do it and felt something ease in her that she had not realized was held tightly. They sat for a while without speaking. The Kokytos made its low sound. The shades at the far passages drifted through their slow patterns, and the torchlight shifted as they passed. She thought about asking him directly what he had decided, what he had worked through in the weeks since she had told him. She did not ask. She thought she already understood the shape of it, and that asking would only require him to make it small enough for words. What she understood was this: he had decided to receive the child as the realm had received everything else, fully, without requiring the child to be other than what it was. There was more to it than that. She could feel the more. But she also knew Hades held things at his own pace, and that the more would show itself in time. Melinoe was born in a place with no particular hour. There was no dawn to accompany her arrival, no bird song, no change in light from dim to brighter dim. There was the stone and the river and the cool air, and then there was a child. Persephone held her first. She was not what Persephone had pictured. Though Persephone understood she had not pictured anything clearly enough to be surprised by, the child was small. All newborns were small, she supposed, though she had no recent frame of comparison. Dark hair in fine threads against a very pale skull. Her eyes, when they opened, were the colour of the passage walls, that particular grey. The thing that registered gradually as Persephone held her and the child's breathing steadied was the quality of her colouring, one side lighter, one side darker, not dramatically, not in the way a cloak is divided. More like the way shadow falls against a surface, when the light source is too indirect to produce a sharp line. The left side of her face and the left half of her small body carried a shade or two deeper than the right. The right side held something warmer, not quite warm, but less deep than the left. Persephone did not remark on it at first. She was occupied with the child's breathing and with her own state, which required attention, when Hades came forward and she transferred the infant to him. She watched his face. He held Melinoe with the careful precision he brought to things he understood were irreplaceable. His large hands, his steadiness. The tablet was somewhere well behind them on the stone shelf, set down and forgotten with no significance at all. He looked at the child for a long time without speaking. Persephone watched the quality of his attention. She had seen him look at shades with careful neutrality. She had seen him look at judicial records with focused concentration. She had never seen him look at something with quite this quality, a stillness that was not composed. That was something more undefended than composure. He said her name softly. Not the child's name, which had not yet been spoken. Persephone's name. She answered. He said only that the child's colouring was visible, that it was there, and he could see it clearly. He paused. Then he said that he found he did not mind it, that what he found himself minding, not in a difficult way, was how closely she was watching him for his response. Persephone was quiet. Then she said she had been watching. She admitted it directly. He turned slightly toward her without shifting the child in his arms. He said she did not have to watch like that, that whatever the child was, the realm had already begun arranging itself around her, that Melinoe had been received. The name arrived in that moment, not decided upon with discussion, simply used by him as the natural word for who the infant was. Melinoe. It suited her. Persephone did not know why she was certain of this, but she was. The child was quiet in his hands. Her breathing was even and slow. She appeared to be considering something very far away, as newborns appear to do, as though still partially occupied with wherever they have come from. From the passages, the shades drifted in the direction they always drifted. Their wordless cadence ran through the air, that old sound, but it had a different quality now. Or perhaps Persephone was hearing it differently, as though the sound had gained an additional resonance. A new frequency it had not possessed before. She thought this child was made partly of that sound, of that particular frequency, of whatever the Kokytos held in its current. She thought, and partly of something else, something that had passed through here in brightness before the brightness dimmed itself back to manageable levels and withdrew. Both things were visible in the child's small body, both fathers. Both registers. Hades carried Melinoe to the bank and stood for a moment at the edge, where the water moved closest to the stone. He did not speak to the river. He simply stood there long enough that the river had the opportunity to note what was being brought near it. Then he turned and brought her back. He settled beside Persephone and held Melinoe between them. The infant's small fingers moved once, opened, and settled against his hand. His hand did not move. He let the contact stand, let it mean what it meant, without adjusting it into something more comfortable or more distant than what it actually was. Persephone leaned slightly toward them both, not heavily, just enough to close the comfortable distance. The Kokytos moved in its ancient way. The torch in the nearest bracket sent its light across the stone shelf, across the three of them gathered there, and across the small two-coloured face of the child, who had arrived from both darkness and light, and would carry both forward into whatever she was becoming. Melinoe grew in the way things grow in the underworld, not by seasons, not by the shortening of days or the first cold edge coming into morning air. She grew by the quiet accumulation of hours, by the slow addition of understanding, by the gradual lengthening of her attention as it reached further from herself into the realm around her. Persephone watched this and found, sometimes, that she did not have adequate language for what she was observing. The child was not like the shades. The child was not like Hades. She was not quite like Persephone herself. She was her own category of thing, and she required her own category of attention. It was in one of the quiet hours, when Melinoe was still very small, that she first asked about above. Not with that word. She did not yet have that word. She pointed instead at the torch bracket on the passage wall and said something that was not quite a question and not quite a statement. Her grey eyes were fixed on the flame. Her small face, with its soft division of warmer and deeper tones, was turned upward and entirely occupied. Persephone followed her gaze to the torch. She said, "That is fire. We keep fire here because there is no other light." Melinoe considered this. Then she asked with the directness children apply to the things that matter most to them, where the light came from. The other kind, the kind that did not need a bracket. Persephone was quiet for a moment. She had not anticipated the question, though perhaps she should have. The child was observant. The child had been observant from very early. Her grey eyes moving across surfaces and then coming to rest on whatever had no clear explanation. Persephone sat down on the stone shelf beside her daughter. She folded her hands in her lap. She thought of how to begin. She said, "Above us is another world. Very far above. The passages go up for a long distance before they open." Melinoe asked if she had been there. Persephone said yes, she had been there for half of each long cycle. She would go again when it was time. The child absorbed this without visible distress. She asked what it was like. This was the question Persephone had not prepared for, not because she lacked memories, but because she had so many that she did not know which to offer first. She had the memory of grain fields in full summer, the colour so specific that she could feel it as warmth against the side of her face even now, here in the cool passage air. She had the smell of her mother's garden after rain. She had the particular quality of late afternoon light when it fell at a low angle through olive leaves and printed small moving shapes across pale stone. None of these translated easily. She began with something smaller. She said, It is brighter than anywhere here, not like more torches. A different kind of bright. It moves across the sky in a slow arc over many hours, and when it reaches a certain angle, it makes everything warm. Not just your skin. The warmth goes further than your skin. Melinoe was listening with the quality of attention she brought to things that had no form she could touch. Persephone said, "My mother kept a garden. Not in a place like this. A garden with open air above it and soil that held moisture from rain." "Do you know rain?" The child shook her head. Persephone described it. She described the sound of it first, because sound was something Melinoe understood well, having grown up beside the Kokytos with its constant low register. She said rain sounded like many small things arriving at once, on leaves and stone and the surface of standing water. She said it had a smell that came before it when the air began to change. Melinoe asked what smell. Persephone found she had to think. It was not a smell that translated into components. It was the smell of the air before rain, which was its own thing and could not be described by referencing other smells because there was nothing else quite like it. She said, "I will describe it to you when you are older and have more words for things. For now, you will have to hold the fact of it without the description." Melinoe accepted this. She had already developed the capacity to hold incomplete information without agitation, which Persephone recognized as something she had inherited from Hades. She asked then about Demeter. She had heard the name. She knew it was someone who mattered to Persephone, someone in the world above. Someone connected to whatever the word mother meant when it referred to a person other than Persephone herself. Persephone took a breath. She said, "Demeter is my mother, your grandmother. She lives above, on the earth's surface, and tends the growth of things, the grain that mortals eat, the flowering of meadows in a certain period of the year." Melinoe asked if Demeter knew about her. Persephone considered the question honestly. She said, "She knows you exist. She does not know you well. The distance between this realm and hers is considerable, and the ways of moving between them are limited by arrangement." Melinoe asked if Demeter had gardens like the ones Persephone had described. Persephone said she had fields that stretched further than you could walk in a day. She said Demeter had made things grow that had not grown before. She said the earth above responded to her presence in ways that were visible from a distance, the way the passages here responded faintly to the presence of certain powerful shades. Melinoe looked at her hands, her left hand slightly darker, her right slightly warmer. She turned them both over and looked at the palms. She asked if she would see the fields some day. The question was straightforward. She asked it without knowing the full weight of what she was asking, without knowing the arrangements that governed passage between the realms, without knowing what her own nature might mean for her movement through the world above. Persephone looked at her daughter's face. The grey eyes were raised now, watching her, waiting with patient curiosity. She said, "I do not know all of what is arranged for you yet. You are still new, and arrangements sometimes clarify as you move forward into them. It was not a refusal. It was not a promise. It was the truth as precisely as she could offer it." Melinoe seemed to hear it as truth. She nodded once, the way she nodded when something had been settled to her satisfaction, however incompletely. She looked back at the torch bracket. The flame moved slightly, as though one of the distant shades had passed through a passage and shifted the air by fractions. She said, "The other light is bigger than that." Persephone said yes. Much bigger. Melinoe considered the flame a moment longer. Then she leaned against Persephone's side, her small two-coloured head settling against her mother's arm, and went quiet, not asleep, simply thinking, in the way she often thought, with her whole body still and her eyes moving slowly across whatever was in front of her. Persephone did not move. She let the child rest against her. The Kokytos continued its low sound through the passages. The torch sent light across the stone floor in a steady, unhurried way. She was thinking of her mother's garden, the smell before rain, the warmth that went further than the skin. She held the memory carefully, as something she would offer again in pieces over time, as something that belonged in part to a child who had not yet seen any of it, and who would require the words for it long before she required the thing itself. Time moved as it did in the underworld, without markers of day or season, measured only by the arrival and departure of certain shades. The periodic dimming and brightening of torches as they burned down and were replaced, and by Persephone's own comings and goings, which were the closest thing to a calendar that Melinoe had. She grew. Not quickly, in the way that mortal children grew, marking seasons against door frames, more the way stone acquires a faint polish over long exposure to passing hands. Gradually, with accumulation, and without obvious announcement, by the time she was old enough to walk the passages unattended, she had developed a habit of going further than she was expected to go. Not in defiance. In the same spirit of patient investigation she brought to everything. She would follow a corridor until the sound of the Kokytos faded behind her, then stand in the new quiet and note what was different about it. Then she would return. It was on one of these longer walks that she came to the place where the passage widened considerably and the ceiling lifted, and the air changed in a way she could not account for by reference to any of the changes she already knew. She stopped. There were 2 torches mounted on opposite walls ahead of her, but between them and beyond them there was something else. A faint luminescence that did not come from the torches, cooler than torchlight. It came from the direction the passage led toward, from somewhere further and above, as if the stone at the far end of the corridor had grown thin and was letting something through. She stood looking at it. She was still standing there when she became aware that she was not alone. The figure at the juncture of the passage and the wider chamber was tall. She carried 2 torches, one in each hand, held level with her shoulders. Her face was composed. She was watching Melinoe without urgency, the way someone watches a bird that has landed unexpectedly near them and they do not want to startle away. Melinoe looked at her, then at the 2 torches, then at the faint light beyond, then back at the figure. She said, "You have too." The figure looked down at the torches. She said, "I do." There was a pause. The Kokytos was inaudible here. The only sound was the low breath of the passage itself. Whatever slow circulation of air moved through these deeper corridors, Melinoe said, "There is light coming from further on that is not from the torches." The figure said, "Yes." She asked, "What is it from?" The figure considered how to answer. Then she said, "It is from the place where this realm meets the one above. There are certain points where the boundary is thin. At those points, a little of what lies on the other side is visible, even from here." Melinoe looked again at the pale light. It did not move. It simply existed steadily in the direction the passage led. She said, "Is that where you come from?" The figure said, "I come from several places. I move between them." She said her name then. It was Hecate. Melinoe had heard the name, not from Persephone directly, but in the way that names circulate through the passages of the underworld. Spoken by shades who remembered invoking her at crossroads, muttered in the half-awareness of the newly arrived who had called on her in moments of uncertainty. She knew the name, the way she knew the sound the Kokytos made when the current ran faster than usual. It was part of the texture of the place. She said, "My mother has mentioned you." Hecate said, "And your mother is someone I have known for a long time." Melinoe accepted this. She walked closer. She stopped within a few feet of Hecate and looked up at her without self-consciousness. With the same direct grey gaze she turned on the stone walls when she was trying to understand the composition of their surface. She asked, "Do you go above?" Hecate said, "Often." "Primarily at night." She asked, "What is it like?" Hecate held one torch slightly higher, not as a gesture of ceremony, but as if she were illuminating a space for the question to enter. She said, "It is large. Larger than you have a reference for yet. The ceiling is very far away and is not stone. It moves, At night it holds points of cold light arranged in patterns. Melinoe said, points of light that are not fire? Hecate said, not fire in the way you know fire. Melinoe turned this over. She said, are they fixed to something, or do they move freely? Hecate said, they appear fixed from below, though they shift over very long spans, but from night to night they are reliable. You can use them to find your way. This interested Melinoe visibly. She looked back toward the faint luminescence at the end of the passage, then at the torches Hecate carried. She said, is that how you find your way above? By the cold lights, Hecate said, partly. Also by what I know of the places where paths divide. Melinoe asked what divided paths were. Hecate said, in the upper world, the paths made by mortals sometimes come to a point where they separate into more than one direction. The traveller must choose which way to continue. These points collect certain kinds of force. I keep watch at them. Melinoe thought about this. She said, do you stand at the division and tell travellers which way to go? Hecate said, sometimes. More often I am there so that the choice carries proper weight. A path chosen at a place of power is chosen more fully than a path chosen in the middle of a straight road. Melinoe was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the passages here do not divide very much. Hecate said, no, the underworld is organized differently. There is less occasion for choice here. She said it without judgment, simply as a property of the place. Melinoe looked at her hands. Left, then right. She turned them, and the torchlight moved across them in the familiar way, darker across one, warmer across the other. She said, I have two kinds in me. Hecate looked at the hands. She said, I can see that. She said it without elaboration, without explanation of what it meant or what it might become. Only acknowledgment, clear and unhurried, that what Melinoe had said was accurate and required no adjustment. Melinoe looked up. She said, does it mean I go between places too? Hecate was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you were made at a place where things cross. What comes from such places often carries that crossing forward. What you will do with it is not arranged yet, but the capacity tends to clarify. It was the kind of answer that asked nothing of Melinoe except that she hold it. She held it. She nodded once. The faint light at the passage's far end remained as it had been, steady and undemanding. Hecate lowered the raised torch back to level. She said, your mother will want to know you came this far today. Melinoe said, I come further sometimes. Hecate said, I know. I have seen you in the passages before today. Melinoe considered this with no particular surprise. She said, you did not speak before. Hecate said, you were not at a point where speaking was required. Today you arrived at a place where two things meet. That is a reasonable place to begin. Melinoe accepted this too. Hecate did not leave immediately. She stood where she was, holding her two torches level, while Melinoe looked once more at the pale light further along the corridor. It seemed no closer and no further than before. Not a destination pressing toward her, more like a shore viewed from water, present and real, waiting in the way that things wait when they are not in a hurry. She did not try to walk toward it. She turned back the way she had come. The familiar sound of the Kokytos returned to her as she moved, its low register rising to fill the silence the way it always did when she re-entered its range. The passages that she knew settled around her again, the torch brackets at their expected intervals, the stone floor worn smooth in the middle where shades had passed for long periods of time. She returned to the place she had left and found Persephone waiting, as Persephone always was, with the patience of someone for whom waiting had been made into a practice rather than an imposition. Persephone looked at her without alarm. She asked how far she had gone today. Melinoe said to the wide place, where the ceiling goes up. Persephone was quiet a moment. Then she said, and what did you find there? Melinoe said, "Someone who carries 2 torches and goes to places where paths divide." Persephone looked at her daughter's face. The grey eyes were steady. She said only, "Yes," and sat back against the stone. Time passed after that, in the way time passed in the underworld, without accumulation, without the sense of one thing closing before another opened. The torches were replaced at their intervals. Shades moved through the outer passages on their ordinary courses. The Kokytos continued its sound. Melinoe sat with what Hecate had said and did not try to work it into a shape. The capacity tends to clarify. She had heard this as a description of something that would happen without being forced. She held it that way. Persephone did not ask more questions about the wide chamber or about Hecate. She had her own knowledge of both, and she seemed to understand that what Melinoe had found there was not yet ready to be explained further. Some things were better carried quietly until they found their own weight, but Melinoe thought about the pale light. She thought about it during the long intervals between torch replacements. She thought about it when the Kokytos was loudest, as though its sound and the memory of that silence were 2 conditions she could hold against each other and compare. The light had not pressed toward her. It had waited, and she had not walked toward it. She was not certain whether that had been restraint or readiness. This was the confrontation she had not fully named, not with Hecate, who had spoken plainly and carried no hostility. The real confrontation was with the light itself, with what it meant to stand before something that led out of the known world and to hold still. She had held still. She did not yet know whether that was the right thing to have done. She went back to the wide chamber. Not immediately, and not in the way of someone testing a decision already made. She went because the question had not finished with her, and she understood by now that unanswered questions of this kind were better approached directly than left in the passages behind her where they might follow. The ceiling rose as she entered. The Kokytos faded. The pale luminescence was where she had left it, at the far end of the corridor, steady and without urgency. Hecate was not there this time. This changed something in the quality of the place. Without the 2 level torches, the chamber was darker, and the cool light at the passage's end was more visible by contrast. It did not flicker. It did not warm. It had the property of something that came from very far away and had lost most of what it carried in transit, arriving changed. Melinoe walked toward it. Not running, not slowly either. She walked at the ordinary pace she used through the passages she knew, the pace of someone with a destination rather than a direction. The stone floor was the same underfoot. The walls were the same pale grey, the same rough texture where she passed her fingers along them. But the light grew. Not dramatically, not in a rush. It built the way knowledge builds when you are not looking for it directly, arriving without announcing itself until the change was already complete. She stopped at the point where the corridor narrowed and the ceiling came down again. The light came through a crack in the stone. A long horizontal fissure, thin as a finger's width, through which something that was not torchlight pressed with patient consistency. She stood in front of it. This was what she had not done before. Before, she had watched it from a distance. Now she was close enough that her breath met the air coming through the fissure, and the 2 currents touched briefly before dispersing. The air from above was different. She could not have said in what way. It was not warmer or colder. It was not scented in any way she had a name for. It simply carried a different quality, as though it had moved through spaces where the things that shaped air were not the same things that shaped the air in the passages she knew. She did not reach her fingers into the crack. She stood close to it and breathed and looked at the light as it fell across the stone floor at her feet. It made a thin bar of illumination, pale and faintly blue, and it lay across her feet without distinction between one side and the other. It did not notice her division. It fell across both sides of her equally, the darker and the warmer, and both received it the same way. This seemed worth noting. She stayed for what felt like a long interval. The Kokytos was entirely absent here. The silence had the texture she remembered from her first visit, wide and unheld, a silence that did not press but simply was. She breathed into it. She let it settle around her. She thought about what Hecate had said of the upper world. The ceiling that moves, the cold lights that are reliable from night to night, useful for finding direction. The places where paths divide, where choices are made with proper weight because of where they happen. She thought about what it would mean to be on the other side of this crack. Not to be the one below, looking up at the light, but the one above, standing on ground that was not stone, under a ceiling that was not stone. In air that had moved through spaces she had no names for. She was not afraid exactly. What she felt was more precise than fear. It was the recognition that what she was standing before was genuinely other. Not hostile, not welcoming. Simply other, in the way that a river is other from the land beside it, occupying the same world but governed by different conditions. She was a thing made at a crossing. Hecate had said this. What came from such places often carries that crossing forward. She looked at her hands in the thin bar of pale light from the fissure. The darker side absorbed the light quietly. The warmer side gave a little of it back. Both were hers. Both had stood here. She turned back. Not because she could not continue. She had the sense, clear and unforced, that the moment had delivered what it contained. The confrontation was not a battle, and it did not end with victory or defeat. It ended the way certain questions end, not with resolution, but with the question placed on steadier ground, held more accurately than before. She knew. Walking back through the widening passage as the Kokytos gradually returned, that she would come through that fissure. Not tonight. The word tonight had no meaning here, but the temporal sense was the same. Not at the next occasion. Later, when the capacity Hecate had described had finished its clarifying. When she arrived at the threshold, not as someone approaching a strange thing, but as someone arriving at a place they had been preparing for, the pale bar of light remained behind her. Falling across empty stone, the passage widened. The torch brackets reappeared at their intervals, each with its orange flame. The sound of the Kokytos rose back into the range of hearing, low and continuous. Carrying its grief without exhaustion, Melinoe walked through it and did not hurry. She did not return to Persephone immediately. She sat for a while at the edge of one of the middle passages, her back against the wall, and listened to the river. It was the sound she had heard from the beginning, the first sound she had known. There was a familiarity in it that asked nothing of her, only that she remained present to it. She pressed her palm flat against the stone floor. The darker side of her hand. It was cool and smooth where the shades had worn it. She could feel the faint tremor of the river through the rock, distant, consistent. Above the fissure, the upper world was carrying on in whatever way it carried on. The ceiling that moved was moving. The cold lights, if it was the time for cold lights, were in their places. Reliable from night to night. She was not there yet. She was here, in the familiar passages, with the river's voice around her and the stone solid underfoot, two kinds present in her, both of them waiting. The shades came to her. That was the thing she had not entirely anticipated. She had understood, in the way one understands things held in description rather than experience, that they would be present. Hecate had mentioned them. Persephone had mentioned them. They were part of what she was. But understanding a thing in description, and sitting quietly in the middle passages while the dead gathered at a respectful remove, were not the same thing. They did not crowd. They arranged themselves at the edges of the passage, where the torchlight from the brackets was thinnest, and they waited there without apparent purpose or urgency. They were not asking anything of her. They were simply near. She watched them from where she sat, her back still against the wall, the stone cool through her. Some of them were very faint, older perhaps, or further along in whatever gradual process the dead underwent here. Some were more present, still carrying the shape of what they had been, the posture of a particular life, the gesture of a particular habit. One stood with arms folded as though waiting for something that would never arrive. Another turned its head at slow intervals, looking from one end of the passage to the other. A motion so familiar it must have come from a lifetime of doing it. Melinoe found she was not uncomfortable among them. This surprised her a little, though it probably should not have. She had grown up within the sound of the Kokytos. She had grown up in a place where the dead were simply the population, unremarkable in the way that stone and river water were unremarkable. But there was something different about this particular gathering. These shades had come to her, not to the passage in general. To her, she considered that for a while. The Kokytos continued below, transmitting its faint vibration through the rock. The torches held their positions. The shades remained at the edges of the light, patient in the way that only the dead could be patient, with no weight of time pressing them. She stood. Eventually, and one of the shades nearest to her shifted, not retreating, adjusting, the way something adjusts when a person in a room moves and the room's balance changes slightly. Melinoe began walking. They followed. Not at her heels, and not in any formal arrangement. They drifted in the way that water finds the lowest course, naturally, without deliberation. She walked through the wider passage toward the branching that led in one direction toward the deep chambers, and in another toward the banks of the Kokytos, and the shades came with her, maintaining their loose formation, their presence low and unhurried. She had not decided where she was going. She let the passage decide. It brought her to the river's edge. The Kokytos was low here, moving close against the near bank with a sound that was not quite water and not quite voice, that grey middle territory between the two. She had sat beside it many times. She knew the particular quality of its banks, the way the stone gave way to darker ground at the water's margin, the way the river moved without any of the brightness that rivers in the upper world were said to carry. She sat again. The shades settled around her, some at the bank, some further back, a few standing very still in the manner of things that have forgotten the difference between standing and not standing. The price of being what she was, she thought, was also its function. They came to her because she was made at the place where the two orders met. They came to her because she was of the Kokytos and of the thing that lay beyond the fissure. She carried both orientations inside her, and the dead could sense what she was in the same quiet way she could sense the tremor of the river through stone. She was not frightening to them. That was worth understanding. The terror she carried, the thing she had felt building in her during the first ascent, the way her presence could unsettle mortal minds, none of that operated here. Here it lay flat. Here she was simply a figure beside a river, and the dead were figures beside a river, and nothing in the arrangement required resolution. The shade with the folded arms had come close. It stood a few arms' lengths from her, not looking at her directly, doing that thing the shades did where attention moved sideways rather than straight. She looked at it for a while. It had been someone. It had done something with its arms during a life that had made the folding of them into a reflex. She did not know what that life had contained. The Kokytos knew, perhaps. The river received everything. She placed her palm against the dark ground at the bank's edge, softer here than the passage stone. The faint moisture of it came through to her hand. The river moved. The shade with the folded arms unfolded them once and then folded them again. It was not communication exactly, but it was something in the range of acknowledgement. She stayed where she was. She let the moment hold itself. This was the wandering she understood. Not the passage through the mortal settlements, not the ascent into dark streets above ground. This here was also the wandering, the moving through the spaces she was made for, the sitting beside the river that was the first sound, the gathering of the dead around her, not because she commanded them, but because she was the place they naturally drifted toward. Her dual nature was not a division to be resolved. It was the condition that made all of this possible. The darker side of her hand rested in the dark ground at the water's margin. The warmer side faced upward toward the torch brackets and the low ceiling. Both were present. Both were occupied. The Kokytos moved through its low range, unhurried, carrying what it carried. Melinoe remained at the bank for a long interval. The shades drifted and held and drifted again. She watched the river's surface, which did not reflect in the way surfaces in the upper world were said to reflect. It gave back a darker version of what was above it, a version with less light and more of the water's own quality worked into it. She thought it was an honest surface. It showed things as the underworld received them rather than as they had been. Persephone was somewhere above, in the chambers where the light from the walls held its pale quality. She would know where Melinoe had gone, or she would not, and either was permitted. Melinoe had stopped asking whether her movements required accounting for. That, too, had clarified without being forced. She looked at her hands again. The torchlight from the bracket above her fell across both of them, orange and flickering, entirely unlike the blue-white bar at the fissure. This light distinguished nothing. It made all of her a version of the same warm colour, which was also a kind of information. Different lights showed different things. The fissure's pale beam showed the equality of her two sides. The torch's warmth collapsed the distinction into one. The shade with the folded arms moved a little further down the bank. The river received it the same way it received everything. Melinoe drew her hand back from the dark ground and pressed her palms together in her lap, both sides touching, the cooler residue of the earth on one, the warmth of the passage air on the other. She stayed. The question arrived without announcement. It did not come from the shade with the folded arms, or from any of the others arranged along the bank. It came from somewhere inside the stillness that had been accumulating around her during the long interval of sitting. It rose up the way the Kokytos' tremor rose through stone, not heard, but felt against the deeper materials. What was she doing with it? The terror. The thing that lay flat here but had not lain flat above. The thing that had moved through her during the first ascent, like a current finding its channel, that had poured out of her into sleeping rooms and dark streets and the unguarded minds of mortals who had not asked to receive it. She had carried it back down with her. She was carrying it now. It rested in her the way the moisture rested in the bank's dark ground. Not active, not absent. Present in the substrate of her, available. Melinoe looked at the Kokytos. The river's surface gave back its dark version of the torchlight. Orange, absorbed, made less of itself by the water's quality. She had not asked, before the first ascent, whither she should go. The pull toward the upper world had seemed like instruction. Something in her composition had oriented in that direction, and she had followed the orientation, the way water follows. The path stone has already prepared for it. She had not stood at the fissure and deliberated. She had simply moved through, but she was sitting now. And the question was present in the sitting, present in the pressing together of her palms, in the cooler earth residue and the warmer air residue, in the held stillness that was not passive so much as gathered. She thought about the mortal who had been awake. Among all the sleeping forms she had passed through, there had been one face turned upward in the dark, eyes open, not dreaming. Seeing her, or seeing the suggestion of her, the pale dark shape that moved through the room shadow with a train of shades at its margins. The face had gone rigid, not with recognition, but with a terror that did not know its own cause. The kind of fear that arrives before understanding does. Irrational, the mortals would say later of such moments. The sudden conviction that something was wrong, that the room had changed, that the body needed to run from a danger it could not name. She had not meant to produce that. She had not aimed the terror at the face. It had simply gone ahead of her, the way the cold goes ahead of deep water when it surfaces in a warm place. The shade with the folded arms was still somewhere to her left, further down the bank now. She could sense it without turning. She thought about the quality of what she carried. Not its force, she understood its force well enough, but its nature, what it was made of. The terror was not separate from her two-coloured form, it was the form in motion. A body that belonged to two orders simultaneously, visible in a realm where only one order was supposed to be present. The mortal mind could not locate her correctly. It tried to classify her, and the classification kept failing, and the failure produced the fear, not because she had come to harm anything, but because her presence was itself a kind of rupture in the expected arrangement. She understood it differently now than she had during the ascent. During the ascent, she had felt the terror as something exhilarating and then troubling by turns, a power that moved without her consent, a force that she had not chosen to wield and could not easily set aside. On the descent back through the passage stone, it had settled, and she had thought perhaps the settling was resolution. It was not resolution. It was information. The Kokytos moved. Its grey surface took the torchlight and returned it darker. If the terror was the form in motion, if the form was not a problem to be solved, but a condition of her nature, then the terror was also a condition of her nature. It would go where she went in the upper world. It would move ahead of her. It would find the open mines and the sleeping rooms and the faces turned upward in the dark. This was the question, not whether she could suppress it, but what she chose to do with the fact of it. She could ascend and let it move freely. The shades would follow. The mortal settlements would be disturbed. Sleepers would carry the unreasonable fear into their waking hours. Rational people would lose the thread of themselves for a time and not know why. Or, the other possibility had a different texture, less immediate. It required something of the mortals rather than simply arriving among them. She had seen, during the wandering, evidence of the other possibility already, small arrangements outside doorways, offerings placed with care at the margins of settlements, at the places where paths met. She had passed through such offerings without fully understanding them, had felt them as a kind of acknowledgement without grasping what they acknowledged. She understood now that they were addressed to her, or to something like her, to the category of night-moving, shade-accompanied, liminal things that the mortals had already learned to recognize and attempt to placate. The mortals who left offerings were not attempting to stop her. They were attempting a different arrangement, an acknowledgement that went in both directions. They named her presence in their way. They named the terror. They set a portion of what they had beside the path and let that be the transaction. And perhaps, she thought, perhaps in that transaction the terror changed. Not disappeared. She did not believe it would disappear. It was of her nature, and her nature was fixed in the particular way that things fixed at their origin are fixed, but changed, redirected. If the fear she carried was the mind's response to an unlocated danger, then a name and an offering were a form of location. They placed her in the arrangement. They gave the mind something to do with the disruption rather than simply absorbing it as chaos. The mortals who had named her and offered to her might sleep without the rigid face and the open eyes in the dark, not because she had become less present, but because her presence had been accounted for. Melinoe sat with this for a long time. The shades drifted. One came closer to the bank's edge, stopped, held. She thought about the difference between a force that moved through a place and a force that was welcomed into it. She thought about the underworld, where she was not frightening to the dead. The dead were not frightened because they already knew what she was. The arrangement was not secret to them. They came to her because the junction she embodied was familiar to them, was in fact the junction they had each passed through. The mortals above had not passed through. They were on the near side of it. To them she was a rupture in the order. Unless she was also a known thing, unless they had been given the means to know her. This was the condition under which her power could shift. She would still ascend. She would still carry the shades behind her through the dark streets. the terror would still move ahead. But the mortals who had learned to set the small offerings at the path's edge, who had spoken the names for what moved through the night, those mortals she could pass through without leaving the rigid face behind. The terror, accounted for, became a different thing, not merely a rupture. A reminder, perhaps. The mind's acknowledgement that the arrangement of the world included more than what daylight showed. She pressed her palms more firmly together in her lap, both sides. Both orientations, present and occupied. The shade with the folded arms drifted back toward her along the bank, not hurrying, moving in that sideways manner, and came to rest at the same distance it had held before. Melinoe looked at the river. The torchlight moved across the water. The water took it and returned it darker, as honest as it had always been. She would let the mortals name her. She would receive what they placed at the path's edge. And the terror that belonged to her nature would be the price and the function at once, the same thing it had always been here, at the bank of the river of lamentation, where the dead drifted toward her not because she commanded them, but because she was the place the arrangement made sense. The Kokytos carried its sound forward, unhurried, taking what was given to it. Melinoe's folded arm shade shifted its weight once, and was still. The thought settled, not with fanfare, not with the sudden clarity that mortals sometimes described as revelation. It settled the way that cold water settles into stone over a long period, filling the available space, going still. Melinoe remained at the bank for a time after the thought had finished arriving. The Kokytos moved past her. The folded arm shade held its position along the water's edge. The torchlight continued its work on the surface, offering orange and receiving darkness in return. She was still sitting that way when memory came, not invited, not sought. Memory in the underworld did not require invitation. It came when it chose, or when the conditions were right for it, when the mind had found a certain quality of stillness, and the river was present and the light was low. She had learned not to resist it. Memory, down here, was its own form of the river's honesty. What came was old. Before the wandering. Before she had known what she was. She had been small. How small, she could not precisely say. The underworld did not keep time in the manner required to say such things, but her hands in the memory were a child's hands. The pale one and the dark one, side by side. She had been examining them, turning them over. Persephone had been preparing. Melinoe remembered the quality of that preparation without being able to name the exact moment it had begun. It was not a single event. It was a gradual gathering, a subtle alteration in how her mother moved through the chambers, a certain direction in her attention. Not toward the shades, not toward Hades, not toward the river or the hall or any of the fixed things of the underworld. The attention moved upward. There was no sky to look at down here. But Persephone found the upward direction anyway, the way that roots find water without being shown. Melinoe had watched her mother without saying anything. She had understood something was being prepared for, without understanding what preparation meant in that context. She had not known, then, about the world above, not fully. She had known it from her mother's words, from the descriptions of light and season, and the smell of things growing. She had arranged those descriptions into a kind of imagined place that she held somewhere behind her eyes. She had not yet understood that her mother would go to that place, and that she would not go with her. Hades had known. He had moved through those days with the particular deliberateness she had come to recognize in him when things were settled but not comfortable. He was never still in the way the shades were still. He was always occupied, but his occupation in those days had a different quality to it. He had found reasons to be in the same rooms as Persephone, not clinging, not asking anything, simply present. The way a thing remains present when it knows it is about to be the only one left. Melinoe had not understood that either. Not at the time. What she had understood was the morning, and she still called it morning because Persephone had called it that, had borrowed the word from the upper world and carried it down. And the household had adopted it for the underworld's equivalent, the time when the light of the torches was freshly lit and the shades were quietest. That morning Persephone had come to her. She remembered the warmth of it, her mother's hands on the sides of her face. The way Persephone looked at her directly and with full attention, in a way that already felt different from ordinary looking, like something being recorded, like something being kept. She had said, "I will come back," not explaining where she was going. She had not needed to explain. Melinoe had understood in that moment what the upward attention had meant. She had felt the explanation arrive in her body before she fully assembled it in her mind. Her mother would ascend, and she would stay. The understanding did not arrive as grief, not at first. It arrived as a factual thing, a shape in the world that she now had to hold. Persephone would go up. The upper world, the world of light and seasons and growing things, would receive her. There would come a time when her mother stood in that imagined place that Melinoe had arranged behind her eyes, and Melinoe would still be here, at the bank, in the torchlight, with the folded arm shade at its usual distance. "I will come back," her mother had said again, and Melinoe had looked at her. She had held very still under her mother's hands. She had felt the weight of what was being offered in those words. Not a promise made lightly, a true thing, a fixed thing, one of the few arrangements in either world that did not shift or renegotiate. Persephone always came back. Melinoe understood this now with the certainty of a much older knowledge. The return was as fixed as the departure, bound by what had been agreed, or what had been taken, or what the upper world required in exchange for its seasons. Demeter's grief released, flowers returning to the hillsides, and then the drawing back down and the return. But that morning, at the door that led up, the door she had never passed through, Melinoe had felt the going as its full size. Not as a bargain, not as an arrangement. As the simple fact of her mother's back moving away from her, and then the door, and then the absence where her mother had been. Hades had stood beside her. He had not said anything. He had not reached for her or offered comfort in words. He had simply remained. His presence at her side was dense and quiet. Not like the shades. The shades were absence. He was presence, heavy and dark and fixed. And standing next to her while her mother went away, she had looked up at him after the door had been for some time. He had looked down at her with the expression that she had never been able to name properly, not warm exactly, not cold. He had the face of someone who had sustained a great number of things without being destroyed by them. He had said nothing, but he had stayed. Memory released its hold slowly. The Kokytos ran on past her in the torchlight. The sound of it, like low lamentation, like something finding its own necessary voice. Melinoe's pale hand and her dark hand rested still in her lap, pressed together, the same hands she had turned over as a child. The same two colours, the same unanswerable arrangement. She thought about the door that led upward. She had stood beside it many times since that first morning, had passed through it herself now, carried the shades behind her into the upper dark, moved through mortal settlements, and come back down again. Persephone had always come back, and Melinoe, in her own way, had learned to come back too. The shade with the folded arms regarded the opposite bank, unhurried, faithful to its own quiet occupation. The Kokytos carried the torchlight forward and delivered it somewhere downstream, changed. The question she had not allowed herself to ask was this: what did they see when she came to them at night? Not in the underworld, not here at the bank of the Kokytos, where the torchlight held its dim orange and the shade with the folded arms maintained its patient position at the water. Here she was simply herself, part of the landscape, a thing that belonged, but above, in the mortal dark. Passing through the narrow lanes of sleeping settlements, her train of shades trailing behind her like a second shadow. What they saw, she had come to understand it gradually, over many ascents, not from being told, from witnessing. A man waking in a cold sweat, staring at a ceiling, unable to name what had passed through his room. A child pulling wool over her face and pressing herself flat against the wall, eyes clenched, lips moving in some wordless appeal. An older woman at a doorway, lamp raised, looking out into the dark with the particular stillness of someone who knows she is not alone but cannot see what shares the night with her. These images came to Melinoe now as they had often come, not with the rush of lived sensation that memory sometimes carried. They arrived flatly, laid themselves down beside the sound of the river, and did not move. She pressed her pale hand and her dark hand together in her lap. A habit, the friction of one against the other. Real, at least, specific. They did not see her the way she saw herself. This was the difficulty. This was the thing that did not resolve. She was the daughter of Persephone, who was warmth. Who was the smell of narcissus, and the particular quality of spring mornings described with such precision that Melinoe had built a whole imagined world from them. She was the child who had sat at the river's edge and been taught the names of the shades. She knew grief as a companion. She had stood at the door that led upward and felt absence arrive as a physical weight in her chest. She had held very still under her mother's hands, and understood that being left behind was not the same as being abandoned. She had learned all of this, had shaped herself around it. None of that was visible when she walked through the mortal dark. What was visible was the two-coloured form, the pale half and the dark half, the shades that moved behind her with their silent mouths, the absence of sound where she passed, as though the air withdrew from her footfall and did not return immediately. What was visible was the thing that broke sleep, that slid beneath rational thought and found what lived under it. Old fear, formless fear, the fear that had no object and therefore could not be reasoned with. She caused it. She understood that she caused it, not as cruelty, not as punishment, simply as consequence. Her nature meeting mortal perception, two things making contact. The result was not pain exactly. It was the dissolution of the ordinary, the ground of a sleeping mind giving way. The Kokytos ran on beside her. That low continuous sound, like a held note, like grief that had learned not to rise and not to fall, but simply to continue. Melinoe had thought in the earlier sense that this was a flaw, a thing she carried from the ambiguity of her making. Two fathers, two colours, a form that did not resolve into one clear thing. She had thought that the terror she left in her wake was the mark of that unresolved nature. She had been wrong, or not entirely right. The truth was less simple. The mortals who encountered her without preparation, without offering, without invocation, without the particular attention that allowed them to see her full form rather than only its most disruptive edges, these mortals fell into the madness because they were meeting something for which they had no frame. She was not merely frightening in the way that a storm was frightening. She was the contact between two kinds of existence that were not built to touch directly. The living mind and the governance of the dead, the mortal dreaming world and the shades that she carried. These things meeting without ceremony, without the protection that ritual provided. The madness was real. She did not diminish it by understanding its source. The man who woke with his heart hammering against his ribs, certain of a presence that had since withdrawn, that man had experienced something genuine. His fear was not irrational in origin. It was irrational only because it had no available object, no name, no ceremony through which to address itself. That was the conflict she could not resolve by thinking about it. She brought the fear whether she intended it or not. She brought it the way fire brought light, as an inseparable part of what she was. and the fear, uncontained, did damage, broke sleep into fragments, left the waking mind scrambling at the edges of things it had glimpsed and could not hold. The shore across the Kokytos was as dark as it always was, featureless. The farthest visible edge of this stretch of the underworld before the dark absorbed everything. She had stood on that opposite bank once, had crossed at a narrow point upstream and stood where the shade was now facing, had looked back at this side, at the torch that marked her usual place, at the water between. It looked like an arrival point from over there. This bank with its orange light, like a destination, like somewhere a thing was meant to come to rest. She had not felt restful standing on the other side. She had felt the particular discomfort of a position that was not hers, and she had come back across. The shade with the folded arms made no sign of noticing anything. It was fixed in its occupation. Whatever inward process it attended to, it did not interrupt. Melinoe uncurled her pale hand and laid it flat on the ground beside her. The dark hand remained in her lap. She felt the stone of the bank beneath her pale palm, cold, faintly damp with what the river exhaled. The texture of it was fine-grained, ancient. She did not have an answer for what the mortals saw, not one that helped them, not one that helped her. What she had was the night itself, the specific dark of mortal settlements seen from above, from within, from alongside, the sound of sleeping breath in rooms she passed through, the particular silence of streets between houses in the deep middle of the dark, when even those who kept irregular hours had finally stopped and the world was at its most still. She moved through that, her shades moved through it with her, and the fear woke as she passed, and the minds of mortals cracked at the seams of ordinary comprehension and let something through. She pressed her palm harder against the stone, felt the cold of it steady and specific. The Kokytos ran, the torchlight held. The distant shore received the darkness between them and gave nothing back. The question remained where she had placed it. Open, unanswered, sitting with the sound of the river like a companion who did not expect a response. What they saw, when she came to them in the dark, the answer came not from thinking, it came from a sound. Somewhere above, not the ceiling of the underworld, which was stone and silence, but the surface world, distant through all the layers of earth that separated this bank from the night sky. A sound that did not arrive through ears, that arrived through something else, through whatever channel permitted her to know when her name was being spoken in the dark, a mortal voice, low, deliberate. She knew the quality of it without hearing the words, the particular care of a person who had decided to address something they could not see, the steadied breath that preceded such an act, the gathering of intention that people performed when they were about to speak across a threshold they could not cross themselves. She lifted her pale hand from the stone. Something was being offered. She could feel that too, not the object itself, but the gesture, the movement of the hand extending outward, holding something, placing it on the ground with deliberate care, stone or packed earth beneath it. Outdoors, the particular cold of open air at the deep hour before dawn. The shade with the folded arms did not stir. Melinoe sat with the sound of the Kokytos moving past and waited for more. The mortal was not alone. There were two voices now, perhaps three. She could not separate them clearly. But the quality held, that careful, attended tone of people who had come to a specific place for a specific purpose and were conducting their purpose with full intention, not stumbling into her path in the dark, not waking into terror from an unprotected sleep. This was different. This was deliberate contact. This was the door, opened from the other side. She had not always recognized this difference so clearly. The first time she had felt it, the pull of offered attention from the mortal world, she had not understood what the pull was. had ascended toward it as she ascended toward everything, with her shades behind her and the familiar dread opening outward from her passage through sleeping streets, had arrived at wherever the voice was coming from, and found mortals who had meant to call her but were still unprepared for the full consequence of her presence. She had caused the madness even then, even when they had tried to receive her, but it had been different. Even the madness had been different, less like rupture, more like the shock of cold water, something the body recovered from, something the mind could set down by morning. The difference was the offering, the act of placing something at the threshold before speaking her name, not a summons, not a demanding call, an acknowledgement extended outward that she existed and that her existence required recognition. She rose from the bank, her dark hand uncurled as she stood, both hands open. The torchlight caught the pale one and left the dark one in its own unreflective shadow. The Kokytos moved below the stone edge where she had been sitting and continued past into the dark. The shade with the folded arms remained where it stood, patient as stone, patient as water. She did not look back at it as she walked. The path upward was not a staircase, not a passage in any architectural sense. It was more like a narrowing of distance, a gradual closing of the gap between one state and another. She moved through it, and the dark of the underworld thinned, and the sounds of the living world began to arrive in layers. First, the absence of the Kokytos. The loss of that held note. The silence where the river had been. Then a faint pressure, the compression of ordinary air, air that moved with wind, air that carried the smell of cool earth, and something dry, something burned. Then the smell itself, strong and particular. Pine resin, wood smoke. The specific smell of resinous wood burning in an outdoor fire, kept deliberately small, kept controlled, burning for ceremony rather than warmth. She paused at the threshold. Below her the shades had assembled without signal. She had not called them, but they came when she ascended, drawn by whatever pull connected them to her wandering. They gathered at the edges of her awareness, patient, diffuse, the accumulated dead, quiet as water held in a cupped hand. She stepped through. The mortal night received her. 3 figures stood at a place where 2 paths met outside the walls of a settlement, not a large crossing. 2 dirt paths intersecting at a slight angle, worn by foot traffic and cartwheels into shallow furrows that caught the faint light from the sky above. The sky was overcast. No stars visible. But the dark had its own faint quality, the ambient grey of clouds reflecting the residue of a settled world below them. The 3 figures stood at the crossing with their backs to each other, each facing a different path. They held small clay lamps. The flames barely moved. On the ground at the centre of the crossing, where all 3 paths converged, a low fire burned in a shallow pit. Pine wood. She could see the grain of it in the coals. The smoke rose and dissolved into the grey above without catching the light. Beside the fire, arranged with care, objects she could see without going closer. A flat cake, the kind made with honey and coarse grain, darkened at the edges from the heat. Small cups, 3 of them, each placed precisely. A length of dark wool, folded once, laid across a stone. She stood at the margin of the crossing, where the path met the uncultivated ground beyond. The shades spread around her in the dark, shapeless, attendant. The central figure, the one nearest the fire, was speaking. The words were not meant to carry. They were meant to go down, to pass through the earth underfoot, through the stone and clay and packed soil, to reach the channels below where the dead moved and where she moved among them. This person understood that communication with chthonic powers was not a matter of volume, it was a matter of direction. Downward, into the ground, into the roots. She heard her name in the words. Not always clearly, but it was there. The sound that belonged to her, spoken in that careful low register. with the particular breathing of someone who was not afraid, or who had decided not to let their fear interrupt the act of speaking. That was rare. She moved a step closer. The nearest figure, a woman, did not turn, did not flinch. The lamp flame bent slightly toward Melinoe, as though the fire could feel what the woman could not yet see. Then it straightened. The speaking continued. Melinoe stood at the edge of the firelight, close enough that the pale half of her face might have caught the orange glow, close enough that the shades drifted at her back like smoke. The words were propitiation. She recognized the shape of them, the specific turns of address that belonged to the chthonic rites, older than the temples on the hill, older than the marble gods. These rites had their own grammar, their own protocol. They did not ask for gifts or intervention. They acknowledged. They named. They placed the offering on the ground and said, "Here." For what crosses between? For what walks with the dead? For the one who carries the dark and the pale, here. The flat cake and the honey, the 3 small cups. The wool. She understood that these things were not for her comfort. She had no particular use for honey cake or wool. The offering was the act of offering. The gift was the attention, the deliberate construction of a threshold marked and named. That said, she was expected here, and that her passage through this place was known and witnessed. The madness did not come. The 3 mortals stood with their lamps. The fire in the pit breezed low and steady. Her shades waited at the margins of the crossing's light, and the speaking continued, unhurried, each word placed with the same careful intention as the cups on the ground. She remained until the words finished. The speaker paused, drew one slow breath, then another, then turned just slightly, chin toward shoulder, not fully turning, not looking directly where Melinoe stood, an angle, a sideways acknowledgement, as though the woman had known all along where she was standing. The flame in the central pit shrank to its coals, a long, slow reduction, not extinguished, diminished. Completing, Melinoe looked at the folded wool beside the stone, dark as her dark hand, placed there by someone who had understood, on some particular level, that the thing they were receiving was made of 2 halves that did not fully reconcile, and that this did not require fixing. She turned back toward the path. The shades followed. The fire held its coals behind her, still warm, giving heat to the empty crossing, the small clay cups, the cake going cold at the centre of a place that had been, for the time of the rite, a known address. The path back was longer than the path out, not in distance, in texture. The ground underfoot changed as she moved away from the crossing, from packed earth to looser soil, from soil to the dry scrub that grew between fields, from scrub to nothing in particular. She walked without urgency. The shades trailed at her back, their movement less like following and more like being drawn, the way smoke follows the source of its heat. The words she had heard stayed with her, not as sound, as form. The way words spoken with that kind of attention leave a residue that persists after the speaking is done. She had heard her own name many times, spoken by mortals, mostly in fear, whispered as a ward against something glimpsed, something sensed at the threshold of sleep. Those utterances were reflex. They carried no direction. The name was spoken outward or upward or into the air without specific destination. It dissolved without arriving anywhere. What she had heard tonight was different. The name placed carefully, like a cup on bare ground. The name spoken with intention toward a destination. Downward, into the channel between living and dead. Toward her. She had not expected it to matter as much as it did. The shades moved with her through the low scrub. The overcast sky held its dull grey. No change in light yet. The hour before dawn still had time in it. She had wandered longer tonight than most nights without the rupture coming, without the particular fracture that sent her shades wheeling outward and the sleeping mortals in nearby houses twisting into their terrors. That absence was not something she could explain by logic alone. She came to a low rise in the ground, a slight elevation where the field ended and the uncultivated land began in earnest. From there she could see the lights of the settlement, small and scattered, oil lamps in windows, or the dying embers of hearth fires visible in the slats of shuttered doors. The settlement was not awake, not quite, but it held the restless non-sleep of the hour before dawn. When bodies lie still and minds move through their own irregular territories, she stood on the rise and looked at those lights. There was something in the arrangement of them, not meaningful, not placed with any intention. Just the ordinary scatter of inhabited space, the way people distribute themselves across a landscape and leave signs of that distribution. Light where warmth is kept. Light where someone has set a lamp against the dark, because the dark feels closer in those hours. She knew about that feeling. She was part of the reason for it. The question that came to her was not new. It had come before on other nights, on other rises above other settlements. It came in a form she had never managed to resolve. Whether the terror was hers to give or hers to withhold, whether it was a thing she carried the way she carried the shades, attached to her nature without her specific choice, or whether there was something in between, some latitude, some range within which she moved. The propitiation rites suggested a version of the answer. When mortals built the threshold deliberately, set the cups and the cake and the wool, directed the words downward with care, the rupture did not come. The shades did not scatter. The sleeping minds in those nearby houses did not twist. This had happened enough times now that she could no longer call it coincidence. But the question that pressed beneath that observation was harder. What about the nights when no one performed the rite? When she moved through a settlement that did not know to acknowledge her, that had no practitioner who understood the grammar of the chthonic rites, no one to stand at the crossing in the dark and say, "Here, for the one who carries the dark and the pale, here." On those nights the rupture came. The shades scattered. The sleeping turned in their beds. The children woke crying without knowing why. Was that her failure? Or simply her nature moving through its own channels? She had not resolved this. She was not resolving it now. The lights in the settlement held steady. A dog began barking somewhere among the buildings, then stopped. The grey above shifted almost imperceptibly. Not lighter, just different. The overcast sky rearranging its density in small degrees. One of the shades drifted forward. Not the one with folded arms. That one remained below, patient at the Kokytos bank. This was a different shade, one that had gathered to her on the first hour of this night's ascent and had remained at her periphery. It moved a few steps ahead of her down the slope, then paused. Not direction. Not warning. Just the particular restlessness shades sometimes showed in the hour before descent. Melinoe understood that she would need to return soon. The path down waited at a distance she could feel rather than see. A pull in the ground beneath her feet, a slight change in the soil's character. The way the earth knew what was below it and transmitted that knowledge upward in small degrees. She turned from the settlement's lights. The path she took wound back through the scrub in a different line than the one that had brought her to the rise, narrower, less worn, the kind of track left by animals rather than carts. The shades thinned around her as she descended the other side of the rise, not dispersing but contracting, drawing closer to her shadow. The smell of pine resin was still faint in her nostrils. The residue of the crossing's fire. She had carried it with her from the ritual pit smoke, that particular smell that marked the threshold between what she was below and what she moved through up here. Below the rise, the open ground levelled out. The scrub gave way to longer grass, dry and pale at the tips, dark at the root. She walked through it, and the grass did not bend as she passed. Only the hem of the dark moved, the slight disturbance of air her movement made, which the grass registered only at its finest tips and only briefly. The words of the hymn were still present, still in their residue form, not repeating. Just there, the way an impression remains in clay after the tool is lifted free, she had been named. She had been described in the particular language of the Orphic rites, the language that understood her as she was. Not as something to be expelled or diminished, but as a figure standing at a specific place in the order of things, liminal, double-natured, the one who walks with the dead through the living world. That description had not softened what she was. It had not removed the rupture from her possible functions, nor reassembled her two-toned form into something singular and uncomplicated. The pale hand was still pale, the dark hand still dark. But the naming had done something smaller, something that did not require a name of its own. It had confirmed that her particular position in the world had a grammar adequate to describe it, that someone had found the words, spoken them in the right direction, and placed them in the ground like offerings. She reached the descent point. The ground here had a quality she recognized. Dense, close-grained. The roots of the grass at her feet were thick and interwoven, the way earth becomes near the places where the path down begins, the shades gathered close. She did not look back toward the settlement. The lights were behind the rise now, out of sight. But she could feel the residue of the crossing's fire still present in the air around her, the pine smoke, the specific warmth of coals that burn for ceremony rather than for heat. She went down. The grey above remained as she descended, the overcast sky neither lightening nor darkening, simply holding. The hour before dawn still present, still containing its own particular quantity of time, above the rise where the lights of a settled world burned low and steady against the dark. The descent closed around her in the way it always did, not suddenly but in gradual increments, the way water rises against a standing body rather than falling from above. The ground's texture changed beneath her feet, from the close-grained soil of the upper threshold to the deeper earth, cooler, denser, carrying its own weight differently from the loose dry soil of the hill's surface. The grass ended, the scrub ended. There was only the path and the shades contracting around her, and the slow withdrawal of the grey sky above. She did not mark the precise moment of transition. She never did. There was no line drawn, no door, no fire. She crossed through on the return. There was simply a point at which the world above was no longer where she moved, and the underworld received her again, as it received all things in time, quietly, without announcement. The shades spread themselves out once more as the pressure of the threshold eased. They had gathered close for the descent, but below they moved at their preferred distances, some near her shadow, some at the periphery where the light of the torches did not fully reach. The restless one that had moved ahead on the slope above settled back to its place at her left, not ahead, not behind, beside. The position it seemed to prefer. She walked. The underworld had its own quality of sound, which was not silence but a particular layering of absence. The lamentations of the Kokytos were audible at a distance, as they were always audible. A low continuous sound that the landscape absorbed rather than reflected, so it seemed to come from everywhere without point of origin. She had come back carrying something from the upper world. Not the pine resin, which was still present, but fainter now, thinning in the cooler air below, something less tangible. The residue of the observation. The sight of those oil lamps burning in the settlement's windows, steady against the dark. The knowledge that in some of those shuttered buildings bodies had slept without disturbance because the rites had been performed, because someone had understood the grammar and had spoken it correctly into the ground. Those who had performed the propitiation rightly had passed through the night intact. This had not always been so clear to her. In the early nights of her wandering, when she had first learned the range of her own capacity, she had moved through the mortal world without understanding what it meant when the rupture came and when it did not. She had understood the mechanics of it, the way the shades scattered on unacknowledged nights, the way sleeping mortals twisted in their beds, the way children woke with fear they could not name. But she had not understood what the difference represented until she had watched, over many nights across many seasons, what the propitiation rites actually did. They were not negotiations. They were not bribes to keep her distant. She saw that now with a clarity that only accumulation of observation could produce. The rites were a form of recognition, a way of marking her presence in the moral landscape of the night. When the practitioner stood at the crossing with the cups and the cake and the wool and directed the words downward, they were not asking her to go elsewhere, they were acknowledging that she was here, that she moved through their world with the dead at her heels, that this was her function, not an aberration, but a defined role in the structure of things. And that acknowledgment changed the nature of her passage through their world, not because she chose to reward the acknowledgment, though something in her did respond to being seen correctly, but because the rite itself altered the texture of the night. It opened a space through which her procession could pass without rupture. The shades, too, seemed steadier on those nights, less prone to the scattered restlessness that preceded terror in the unacknowledged hours. A new lamp burned at a small shrine set into the rock face along the path she now followed, a flat pressed clay vessel no larger than a cupped hand, its oil nearly spent. Someone who attended the deeper shrine had left it burning. The clay was dark with use, its lip worn smooth at the point where the wick had been pressed repeatedly into place. Beside it, pressed against the rock, lay a small piece of worked fleece, white and dense, folded twice. Careful, deliberate. She stopped, looked at it without touching. These were not offerings left in response to terror or in the hope of escape. They were left by someone who understood what she carried and had decided to stand in right relationship to it. The fleece was clean. The lamp was maintained. This was not appeasement from a position of fear. This was acknowledgment from a position of knowledge. Her mother had told her once, in the way Persephone sometimes spoke of the upper world when Melinoe was young, that the most powerful thing a mortal could do in the presence of something greater than themselves was simply to name it accurately and not look away. Persephone had been speaking of the dead, of the way mortals struggled to acknowledge their own mortality without flinching into denial, but the principle held here too. Those who named Melinoe accurately, who described her as liminal and double-natured, who left their offerings directed downward with words that understood her function, were not diminished by the encounter. They were steadied by it. The thing they had feared, the wandering goddess with her train of shades, her pale hand and her dark hand, her presence that pressed at the edges of dreams, had a name, had a grammar adequate to it, and once a thing is named correctly, the fear it provokes transforms into something the mind can hold without fracturing. She moved on past the shrine. The lamp's small flame did not gutter as she passed. The worked fleece did not stir. The shade with folded arms was visible at a distance now, at the Kokytos bank, where it had waited through the night's ascent and the night's return. Patient, still. The river's lamentation moved past it without seeming to touch it, the way grief sometimes moves past the long grieved without finding new purchase. Melinoe walked toward it. The torchlight steadied around her. The shades settled into the rhythms of below. Above her, through the rock and the earth and the overcast sky she could no longer see, the hour before dawn continued its slow holding. In the settlement, the oil lamps burned their last oil in their windows. Someone would wake soon and press new wicks into place, and the night would end, and the mortals who had slept undisturbed would rise without knowing the fullness of why the dark had treated them gently. Only some of them would know. The ones who had stood at the crossing with their offerings and their downward directed words. And even they would not know all of it, only that they had done the right thing in the right language at the right hour. The fleece pressed against the shrine rock held its careful folds through the thinning dark. The shade with folded arms did not look up as she approached. It had been this way for as many nights as she could remember. The figure stood at the Kokytos bank with its arms crossed over its chest and its gaze directed toward the far water, and it waited. She had never learned what it waited for. She had stopped needing to know. She came to stand a few paces from it. The river moved past them both, low, continuous. Its sound was less lamentation up close than it was from a distance. From a distance it carried grief like a carried burden, something felt through the shoulders. Up close, at the bank, it was more like breath. Something that simply kept going because stopping was not among its available choices. She looked at the water. Her reflection divided where the current moved through it. The pale half of her face caught the torchlight differently than the dark half. One caught it and held it, one took it in and did not return it. She had grown accustomed to this division in reflective surfaces. The way her face never appeared as a single thing, only as two things placed beside each other. Water showed it most clearly. The Kokytos remembered this place. She understood that now, in a way, she had not as a child, when the river had simply been the sound of the underworld's constant grief, something as unremarkable as the stone walls of her home. She understood now that she was part of what the river remembered. Her birth had occurred near this bank. The water had received whatever sounds she had first made. The lamentation of the Kokytos and the first noise of Melinoe were woven together, and the river carried both forward without distinction. She sat down on the stone at the bank's edge. The restless shade that preferred her left side drifted closer. It did not settle, but it moved within the range it seemed to find acceptable. She was aware of it, the way she was aware of her own hands, a presence accounted for without requiring attention. The pine resin scent was nearly gone now. It had thinned with descent and distance, the upper world's particular smell burning off the way oil burns from a lamp nearing empty. There was only the underworld's own smell now, damp stone and cold air, and the faint mineral quality of deep water. She had always found this smell clarifying. Not pleasant in the way upper world smells were described as pleasant, flowers and rain and bread described in her mother's stories of Demeter's fields, but clarifying in the way that simplicity is clarifying. There was nothing surplus in the smell of deep stone, nothing layered onto what the thing essentially was. She thought about what her mother had given her in those early years, not the specific lessons, the disposition beneath the lessons. Persephone had carried both worlds in her body. She had moved between them each year for as long as the mortal world had kept its seasons. She knew how to hold one thing without releasing the other. She knew how to be the daughter of green fields and the queen of the silent kingdom, and to let both remain true simultaneously, without forcing them into resolution. She had passed this to Melinoe, not as instruction but as example, the way a body learns balance by watching another body balance. Melinoe had watched her mother exist as a doubled thing for long enough that doubling became, if not comfortable, at least familiar, the condition of being two things at once. The cost and the grace of it together, inseparable. She extended her pale hand over the water, watched it in the reflection. Her two fathers had given her different things. She had thought about this before. She returned to it sometimes in the way the mind returns to certain textures, not to resolve them, but because something in the return is itself useful. Zeus had given her the part that moved outward, the part that ascended, that entered the mortal world with its train of shades and pressed at the membranes of sleeping minds. There was an upward quality to that function, an outward-reaching quality. It was not benevolence. It was not malice. It was force moving in a direction. Hades had given her the part that held, the part that knew the underworld's rhythms. That understood the shades not as followers but as wards. That recognized the Kokytos not as a symbol of grief but as an address, a specific location that could be returned to. Neither gift was clean. Both came with their difficult adjacencies. Zeus's upward reach brought terror alongside passage. Hades's holding quality brought stillness that could shade, in weak hours, into a kind of gravity she had to consciously resist. The dangerous grace her nature carried was not separable from the blessing. They were the same thing seen from different angles. She had accepted this. It had not been a single moment of acceptance. It had accumulated the way the worn lip of the shrine lamp's clay had accumulated, press by press, use by use, until the smoothness was there, and no single occasion could be identified as its cause. She withdrew her hand from above the water. The shade with folded arms remained where it stood. Something in its stillness had a quality of long accommodation. A figure that had arrived at the place it would be, and had decided to remain. She did not know what the figure remembered, or whether it remembered anything at all. The shades carried their histories in ways that were not always accessible from outside, and she had learned not to assume knowledge of their inner states from their outer presentation. But something in the stillness felt appropriate to this hour, above her. Somewhere through the stone and the cold dark, the hour before dawn was ending. The settlement's lamps would be guttering or already replaced. The mortals who had slept well would wake into a morning they would not be able to explain, a sense of having moved through the night untroubled, a quality of rest that felt more complete than usual. They would not name it correctly. Most of them would not try. The ones who had stood at the crossing the night before with their cups and their wool and their downward words would know more. They would carry a different quality of understanding into the morning. Not complete understanding. No mortal carried complete understanding of the things she touched, but an accurate understanding named correctly and therefore capable of being held. Melinoe looked at the river. The Kokytos moved over its stones. Its sound was breath, and it was memory, and it was simply itself, the way any old thing becomes simply itself once it has been present long enough. She had been present long enough, not everywhere. Not in every mortal mind that had twisted through a night of unmade fear, not in every crossing where no offering waited and no words were spoken downward. But here, at this bank, with the shade beside her and the torch burning and the pale hand and the dark hand both resting now against the stone. Here she had been present long enough to know what she was. The river accepted that knowledge without comment. It moved on past the bank, past the waiting shade, past the torchlight's reach, into the further dark of the underworld's long interior, carrying its grief and its memory and its continuous sound into the places where even she did not go. She remained. Still, the torchlight held steady around her without effort. The restless shade had stopped its movement and stood now slightly behind her left shoulder, no longer circling, simply present. The shade with folded arms kept its patient position at the water's edge. Something in the arrangement felt, for this moment, exact. The exactness did not last. It never did, and she had stopped expecting it to. The moment simply held for as long as it held, and then the river shifted slightly in its course over the stones, and the torchlight breathed, and the arrangement became something slightly different, not wrong, just different. Melinoe let her weight rest more fully against the stone beneath her. The cold of it came through slowly, a steady seeping that was not unpleasant. The underworld stone had its own temperature, neither hostile nor welcoming. It was simply the temperature of old things that had never known the sun. The restless shade at her left shoulder made a small movement. Not the circling that had marked its earlier hours, something more subtle. A shift of its position, as though it had settled more completely into the ground beneath it, finding a different angle of rest. She did not look at it directly. She was aware of it, the way she was aware of most things here, through peripheral attention, through a knowledge that did not require the directness of a gaze. The shade with folded arms remained at the water's edge, unchanged. Above the river's far bank, the darkness had a particular quality in this hour. Not heavier than before, but more present, as though the underworld's interior had gathered itself into a kind of attention. She had noticed this before, at certain hours, in certain locations. The dark here was not the absence of light. It was a substance with its own properties. It pressed gently. It held. She thought of the space between the underworld and the night sky. It was not a space she had a precise name for. The underworld's ceiling opened in certain places through passages that had no proper designation in the cosmological accounts she had encountered. They were simply there. The Gate of Dreams was one such opening. The hidden paths she used for her ascents were others. Passages that existed at the edge of categories as she existed at the edge of categories. What she knew of the night sky came mostly from the hours she spent moving through the mortal world and from the hours just before her return. When she had reached the uppermost passages and could feel, ahead of her, the shift from underworld stone to open darkness with its cold different from the underworld's cold. A surface cold, touched by movement, carrying traces of everything the night air moved through. She had never been able to name it correctly. It was the smell of the world above her, the world that was not hers. Hecate moved through that space as through something familiar. Melinoe had observed this. Hecate carried her torches through the crossroads with a quality of ownership that was not arrogance, simply recognition. The recognition of someone who knows the ground they walk because they have walked it for longer than the ground itself has been named. She wondered if Hecate was somewhere in the darkness above the river's far bank now. There was no way to know. Hecate did not announce her presence. She was either there or she was not, and either condition was equally possible from where Melinoe sat. Something in the wondering was itself a form of company. The shades that had accompanied her from the mortal world had dispersed after her return, moving back into the underworld's interior by degrees, carried along by the slow currents of that place. These two had remained. She did not know why these two and not others. She had stopped asking that question some time ago. The shades made choices that were not readable to her, and she had learned to receive those choices without requiring their explanation. The river's sound continued. Low and even it moved across the stones. In this close proximity it did not have the quality of lamentation that gave it its name. Lamentation was the word the distance applied to it. Up close it sounded more like the movement of any water over any stone, which was to say it sounded like duration itself, the continuous passing of one moment into the next. She had been conceived here. Her first connection to place had been this cold and this sound. She thought about that sometimes, not with grief and not with celebration, but with something that did not have a word, the recognition that origin is simply origin. It does not determine everything, but it does determine something, and knowing what that something is forms part of the knowledge of oneself. The river had received her first cries. The Kokytos had been the first thing she heard, and the first thing that heard her. There was a completeness to returning to it that she did not feel in other places. Not comfort exactly, completion. A curve that meets its own beginning without needing to become a circle. Her pale hand rested still against the stone. Her dark hand lay beside it. Two colors, two temperatures of light. The pale side held the torchlight in a way that made the light visible on the skin's surface, collected it, and gave it back. The dark side received the light differently, absorbed it, so that the two hands together formed a kind of continuous conversation between holding and releasing. Zeus had given her the releasing. Hades had given her the holding. She had thought about this so many times at this bank that the thought had worn itself into a smooth thing. It no longer snagged on her. It simply moved through and settled. The price of each gift remained. Zeus's outward reach carried the terror that could break a sleeping mind that had no preparation, no offering, no accurate naming to protect it. Hades's stillness carried the pull toward the permanent dark that she had to hold deliberately at a distance in the hours when her ascents were long past and the underworld's gravity was the only gravity around her. Neither gift was given cleanly. Both arrived with their cost already attached, folded into the giving. She understood this the way she understood the cold of the stone, steadily, without flinching and without pretending the cold was warm. The shade with folded arms shifted its weight fractionally, still facing the water, still not raising its gaze to her. But something in the small movement felt almost like acknowledgement, a slight change in the angle of presence. She received it as such without insisting on it. The torch's flame drew a boundary around the bank, a soft edge where its light ended and the underworld's interior dark began. Within the boundary she could see clearly the stones, the water moving over them, the two shades in their positions, her own hands. Beyond it, the dark held its distance. She was familiar with boundaries. She was one, not a wall, not an obstacle, a place where two conditions exist in proximity, where one thing is still itself and another thing is also itself, and between them there is a narrow space that partakes of both without belonging entirely to either. That space was where she lived, had always lived, had been built to live by the dual architecture of her parentage, by the location of her conception, by the nature of the work she was given. Hecate lived there too, in her way. Persephone had learned to inhabit a version of it. But neither of them was made from it the way Melinoe was made from it. She was not a goddess who moved through liminal space. She was a goddess whose substance was liminality itself. The river continued past the bank, past the torchlight's reach, into the dark interior, carrying its grief and its ordinary sound together, indistinguishable from each other in the lower registers. She remained where she was. The restless shade breathed a quiet breath behind her left shoulder. The shade with folded arms kept its watch over the water. The torch held. Something moved at the boundary of the torchlight, not the shades. They had not changed position. The restless one still breathed at her left shoulder, a fractional presence. The other still held its watch at the water's edge. What moved was the light itself. A slight contraction, then a steadying. The torch had caught a current of air from somewhere deep in the underworld's interior. It recovered without assistance and burned on. She watched the boundary reform, the soft edge returning to where it had been. Persephone would understand this. The contraction and the steadying. Her mother had spent a life, or the underworld's version of one, learning to hold herself at her own boundaries without losing the core of what she was. Every ascent to the upper world, every descent back through the dark gate, had required a version of that recovery, the flame pulling inward. Then steadying. Melinoe had not always understood why her mother returned from above with a particular quality of exhaustion that differed from the exhaustion of the underworld. She understood it better now. The upper world pressed on Persephone in ways that this place did not. It asked her to be the spring goddess, the daughter of Demeter, the light-bearer for a world of growing things, and she was all of those. But she was also the queen of this cold realm, and holding both simultaneously was its own labour. Melinoe carried both simultaneously without the option of choosing a season. That was perhaps the one thing her existence clarified that her mother's did not. Persephone moved between her two natures in time. Melinoe occupied hers all at once. There was no upper world for her, no season of relief where only one inheritance applied. The pale and the dark met at every moment, at every breath, at the line running through her body where Zeus's gift pressed against Hades's stillness. She thought of Zeus, not with warmth and not with bitterness, with recognition. He had not come to the Kokytos seeking her specifically. She had been the consequence of a meeting that preceded her entirely. She knew this, had known it for long enough that the knowing had settled into simple fact. But whatever his intention, what he had placed in her was real. The outward reach, the force that moved through the pale side of her form and sent her up through the dark gate and into the breathing world of mortals. That force was his. He had not stayed. But what he left behind had given her movement. She thought of Hades, the one who had remained, not her father by blood, or only partially. The Orphic accounting of her parentage folded both names into the same moment of conception, as though the distinction the two men held mattered less than the fact of the underworld's presence in that making. Hades had not fathered her in the clean way, but he had held the space she was conceived in. His realm had been the vessel, and he had looked at her. That was what she returned to sometimes when she was at this bank and the underworld's silence was at its deepest. The way Hades had looked at the infant she had been, not the way of a father confirming possession, not with the uncomplicated pride that some gods wore when surveying their offspring. He had looked at her with the particular attention of someone who was trying to understand a thing that had arrived outside the expected order. She had grown to recognize that attention. She had seen it later in the faces of mortals who woke from the kind of dream she sent, the ones who sat upright in the dark with their hearts loud in their chests and their eyes wide, not with terror exactly, but with the aftermath of having perceived something true that they had not been prepared to perceive. That was Hades's attention, the look of someone encountering a fact. He had accepted her, not immediately, but genuinely. And that acceptance had given her the holding, the dark side of her form that received light rather than reflected it, the gravity that kept her from dispersing into pure wandering, pure outward reach. Without the holding, the reaching would have no centre to return to. Both fathers had given her something necessary, neither had given her something comfortable. She had stopped requiring comfort from the source. What she had was functional, accurate, sufficient to the work. The shade with folded arms turned its face slightly, not toward her, toward the upstream dark where the river came from. Something in the water's sound had changed almost imperceptibly, a minor shift in register, as though a tributary had altered its pressure somewhere far back in the underworld's interior. She listened. The sound levelled again. The river resumed its even note. She had spent so long in this place listening to the variations of that sound. The Kokytos did not deliver the same note twice in succession. It approximated its own sound endlessly, and each approximation was close enough to the last that the difference was nearly nothing, but nearly nothing, heard over long enough, accumulated into something. She could not have named what it accumulated into, only that she heard it differently than she had at the beginning. Her pale hand lifted slightly from the stone, then returned. A small thing, not a decision. Just the hand's own momentary movement. Hecate had once said, in one of those crossroads meetings where the air smelled of pine and old stone, and the dark was a different quality of dark than the underworld's, that the gods who endured were the ones who had found their work and stopped arguing with it. She had not said it as advice. She had said it the way she said most things, as an observation from someone who had been at crossroads long enough to have noted many such patterns. Melinoe had not responded to it then. She had received it and kept moving, but the observation had stayed, the way certain things stay, resting in a place below argument. She had found her work, not found in the sense of discovery, of searching and arriving, found in the sense of recognizing what had already been assigned by the nature of what she was. She sent terror when she was unpropitiated. She withdrew terror when the offerings came. She moved through the mortal night carrying her train of shades, pressing against the sleeping minds she passed. And for those who had learned her name, who had left the dark honey and the midnight smoke at their thresholds, she moved past without pressing. That was the work. Simple when stated, not simple in the doing. What strikes me most about this story is how it mirrors our own struggles, the choices we make, the loves we risk, the moments that define us. Perhaps that's why these ancient tales endure. Melinoe did not choose what she was, but she chose, in the long accumulation of nights and returns and riverbank silences, what she did with it. If you made it to the end, thank you. Take a moment to like and subscribe if these stories have become part of your nights here on Olympus Dreams, and let me know in the comments that you stayed. It always means something to know who was here. The restless shade had gone still at her left shoulder. Its particular quality of agitation had softened over the last passage of time. She had noticed this without noting a specific moment of change. Stillness had arrived in it the way most things arrived in the underworld, gradually, without announcement. She looked at her 2 hands on the cold stone, pale, dark, the torch above them holding. The Kokytos moved past, carrying the old sound forward, the continuous passing, stone under water, water over stone, the same and not the same from one moment to the next. Her dark hand turned, palm upward on the bank, open to the cold air above the river where she had first been heard.